Donald Trump and the Know Nothing Movement. Understanding the 2016 U.S. election. J. E. Ray J. Volle. My aunt and godmother Diane Kervink Brown. 7. I would like to thank Michelle Chen, editor at Palgrave Macmillan, for her professionalism, assistance, and guidance throughout the process of writing this book. I would also like to thank editorial assistant John Stegner for all his assistance in getting the final manuscript completed. Nancy Johnson at the Penfield Library, Special Collections at the State University of New York at Oswego for all her assistance. Cynthia M. Van Ness, MLS, Director of Library and Archives at the Buffalo History Museum for all her help in checking on images of President Millard Fillmore. Kevin Slodick as always for his assistance in formatting the photographs and computer assistance. Chapter 1. Introduction. Abstract. From the Chinese, to the Irish, to Jewish, and to the Japanese, Americans have let their paranoia supersede judicious reasoning. Not to be outdone by the aforementioned examples of historical hysteria, the 2016 presidential election in the United States brought the know-nothings back from the depths of history. This book examines the background of the Know-Nothing movement in the 1850s and those parts of the movement that have re-emerged in the 21st century with the election of Donald Trump. Keywords: 2016 presidential election, Know-Nothing, prejudice, Donald Trump. Almost 2 centuries ago, a large part of the population of the United States was anti-immigration and anti-Catholic. Most of the population was concentrated in the northern states. After gaining a substantial share of the presidential vote in 1856, the American Party, as it was officially named, splintered, with some of its members joining the Republican Party by 1860. The Know Nothing Party, as the American Party is known to most Americans today, represented a small fragment of political thinking, but only lasted a short period of time. Although anti-Catholic sentiment has dissipated since the 1850s in the United States, anti-immigration attitudes have continued to target certain groups ever since. 2. From the Chinese, to the Irish, to the Jews and to the Japanese, Americans have let their paranoia supersede judicious reasoning. Not to be outdone by the aforementioned examples of historical hysteria, the 2016 presidential election in the United States brought the know-nothings back from the depths of history. This book examines the background of the Know Nothing movement in the 1850s and those parts of the movement that have re-emerged in the 21st century with the election of Donald Trump. The Know Nothing movement was not the only political group integrated into the Trump coalition. Governor George Wallace's American Independent Party, at its apex during the 1968 presidential election, was reborn in 2016 as a reaction to the development of movements such as Black Lives Matter and the loss of blue-collar jobs in the Midwest, blamed in part on the NAFTA agreement signed in 1993 under President Bill Clinton. Of course, the era of Bill Clinton continued with his wife's nomination in 2016 as the Democratic candidate for president. There will be an avalanche of academic books written about the 2016 presidential election, as well as books written to provide the red meat so many partisans desire in today's age of Google. The academic field of politics is rapidly becoming substituted, or at least challenged, by Google, partisan news networks and political websites that feed the appetites of the left and the right. This book seeks to answer the question, has the United States electorate learned from past third-party political movements? Presidential elections in the United States are a narrative of the time in which they are held. As presidential historians and political scientists examine past eras and presidents who were considered able and honorable for much of the past century, some, such as Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, are now being criticized for their policies of discrimination. Our ancestors face judgment today due to the evolution of ideas of human dignity. However much information the American voter can access via a Google search in a matter of minutes, presidential historians and political scientists have examined all 57 presidential elections with fervor and expertise. It is in terms of the 58th presidential election that the field of psephology will be severely tested and extensively debated. Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election in the Electoral College, but lost the popular vote to former Senator and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton by 3 million votes, a feat only occurring 3 times in the 19th century, 0 times in the 20th century and 3. Already 2 times in the 21st century, in 2000 with Al Gore and George W. Bush and, of course, in 2016. The American people are now beyond a functional divide that has been the norm since the Founding Fathers debated the structure of the new government. The decades-long tradition of compromise between political parties to achieve grand accomplishments has been eroded in the last decade since the election of George W. Bush, leading to the election of President Donald Trump and the renaissance of the anti-establishment voter. Of course, both political parties' leaders point the finger at one another as the reason for this dysfunction. This book won't change that view. However, the presidential election of 2016 inspires those who revel in psephology to once again examine the 1856 and 1968 presidential elections. Perhaps by re-examining these 2 elections the nation will be able to prepare for what is to come over the next 10 years and beyond in the U.S. government. Violence has been a part of American political culture since before the age of the Internet and will remain so generations from now. The 2016 presidential election has driven the anger of the American voter to heights not seen since the dark days of the Vietnam War and only surpassed during the American Civil War. Anger has now resulted in more than fistfights at presidential rallies. The shooting of Republican Congressman and Majority Whip Steve Scalise and 3 others outside a baseball field in Virginia was politically motivated, as an anti-Trump person took his anger about a presidential election loss to new and despicable lengths. A rally in Charlottesville, North Carolina, in support of keeping a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee standing, and the counter-protests that came out in force, resulted in a violent clash that led to the death of one of the counter-protesters. Americans are crossing a line that could gradually begin to erode the basic fundamentals of democracy, compromise, and the decency of discussion. At one time a presidential candidate addressed the following words to the delegates listening in the Miami Beach Convention Center and to the American voter able to stay up very late. Together we will call America home to the ideals that nourished us from the beginning. From secrecy and deception in high places, come home, America. From military spending so wasteful that it weakens our nation, come home, America. Introduction. 4. From the entrenchment of special privileges in tax favoritism, from the waste of idle lands to the joy of useful labor, from the prejudice based on race and sex, from the loneliness of the aging poor and the despair of the neglected sick, come home, America. Come home to the affirmation that we have a dream. Come home to the conviction that we can move our country forward. The candidate was Democrat Senator George McGovern, who went on to lose the 1972 election in a landslide to President Richard Nixon, only winning Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Weren't the Trump campaign and its supporters, in many ways, all about American coming home? Perhaps the slogan may fit today, but do President Trump and his supporters want to go back to past decades of suspicion, discrimination, and obstinate behavior? Angry voters are not something new to our democracy, and leaders will exploit that anger by forming political parties ready to fight for their particular cause. All this effort is made in the name of democracy, no matter if their cause is for the short term or the long term. The American Party, as they called themselves in 1856 to soften their anti-image, better known to most as the Know-Nothing Party, steadily grew from the previous decade. This growing bloc of voters were anxious about the influx of immigrants who were not Anglo-Saxon nor Protestant. Anti-immigration was the key issue rallying the Know-Nothings to form a legitimate party challenging the Democratic and Whig parties. Adding legitimacy to the Know-Nothing cause was the acceptance by Millard Fillmore, who had served as the 13th President of the United States, to be their presidential candidate in 1856. Recruiting a past president to run on another political party's ticket other than one of the 2 major parties is an almost inconceivable idea to contemplate today. The Know-Nothing Party simply added its anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic cause to the mountain of sectional schism already formed between North and South. But the division in America was not over. The decade of the 1960s started with a new frontier and ended with the Democratic Party trying to justify a growing federal government aimed at giving back African Americans a stolen innocence and identity. The year 1968 witnessed the greatest number of events that changed the United States since the end of the World War II in 1945. The list is staggering, including the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson declaring he would not run for re-election, Martin. 5. Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Senator Robert F. Kennedy's assassination, the strong showing of segregationist Governor George Wallace in the 1968 presidential election and the subsequent election of Richard Nixon in that election. Even 50 years later, the implications of 1968 and the perseverance of democracy never ceases to amaze those who study this era. Besides the Nixon presidency, the one lasting figure from 1968 was George C. Wallace. The confrontational, segregationist, and brash governor of Alabama was the symbol and leader of a new movement of not only Southern nationalism, but also Northern blue-collar pragmatism. Wallace picked up where Strom Thurmond left off as a Southern Democrat running as the candidate of the States' Rights Party in 1948. By 1968, the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War protests brought to the forefront angry young white and black youths rioting, a scene unsettling to most in predominantly white middle-class America. The Wallace coalition began to show its strength once again in the 1972 Democratic primaries as George Wallace won the Florida primary and came in second in the state of Pennsylvania. However, Arthur Bremer's sick mind and snub-nosed .38 revolver stopped Wallace's momentum and paralyzed the governor for life as he campaigned in a Maryland grocery store parking lot. Wallace would go on to win the Maryland and Michigan primaries the next day on May 16, a victory lost in human anguish. With the Wallace coalition now lacking its leader, the new left under George McGovern moved its political army of millions into strategic position and took over the Democratic Party along with the 1972 nomination. Wallace's Southern nationalists and blue-collar pragmatists were now without a party. Even the election of a Southerner, Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, in 1976 over President Gerald Ford did not fully satisfy the Wallace followers. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 filled the void for many of these Wallace supporters for the following 12 years. As the Democratic Party was reeling from losing 5 of the 6 presidential elections from 1968 to 1988, Bill Clinton stopped the political hemorrhaging with a victory in 1992 followed by another in 1996. George W. Bush won the 2000 election, with help from the United States Supreme Court, over Vice President Al Gore. This controversial election brought partisanship to a new high by 2008 with the arrival of a young senator from Illinois, Barack Obama. The divisions in the country were not only found in Washington, D.C., but among the American people across all regions of America. The acceleration of partisanship reached its climax with the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act in 2010 by a democratically elected Democrat majority, as conservative Republicans used this act as a rallying cry for their supporters. One evening in 2009, American political civility disappeared in the sacred halls of democracy when Representative Joe Wilson, Republican from South Carolina, yelled "You lie," in response to President Obama's statement that the health care reform he was proposing to a joint session of Congress would not ensure illegal immigrants. A line was crossed. When Sarah Palin said the same health care reform proposed by President Obama would contain government death panels to determine whether the disabled or sick elderly would qualify for coverage, the opposition to the Affordable Care Act had their spokesperson. And then, when Donald Trump challenged the President of the United States, Barack Obama, to produce a birth certificate on March 23, 2011, the line that Joe Wilson had crossed was no longer in sight. The war of hidden debate has now replaced newspapers and magazines that gave voice to open thought. An individual's right to tweet, blog and post on Facebook is not creating the next Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Paine. These platforms are now the way democracy communicates political thought. So here we are today. The man who hounded the 44th President of the United States to produce his birth certificate has now been elected President of the United States through the same democratic process that elected Barack Obama. The election of Donald Trump has further split the already divided electorate, and this divide will last a long time. The political division that has deeply scarred the United States has the fingerprints of the American voters all over it. The Women's March on Washington, a 500,000-strong event held the day after the Trump inauguration, reinforces this statement. Of course, there were 500,000 female supporters of Trump across America who thought this outpouring of defiance and protest was unwarranted. The 8 years of outrage and anger from the right wing of the Republican Party, the only wing left, has now been flipped again, with left-wing anger flowing with thoughtful rage. As the 21st century approaches the 20-year mark, the divisiveness that our political system has wrought is a call for help. The country's political system is broken. This book argues that understanding our past history, our politics, and the compromises that have taken place over 200 years is invaluable. The field of political science and the presidential historians who study our country's extensive political history do so not to seek riches, but to enrich the country's understanding of what came. 7. Before us and what we as a nation can expect. The assessments of these men and women may not be flawless, but we are all better for their tireless efforts. And all of this leads us once again to our past. The Know Nothing Party existed at a time of anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic bias some 170 years ago. A fear of uncivilized protest and an overbearing federal government led to George Wallace's 1968 presidential run as the American independent candidate. Millard Fillmore's strong showing in 1856, and George Wallace's even stronger showing in 1968, gave the political system something to think about for many years. Both of these movements, the Know Nothings and the American Independent Party, faded as party labels. However, the mindset of their followers did not. This is not to say that those parties' views were acceptable, but they represented how some Americans felt at particular times in history. It is important to understand why they felt as if their way of life was being threatened. The anger of the Know Nothing followers was fueled almost entirely by the newspapers along with their personal experiences with immigrants and Catholics. The fear of losing their jobs to immigrants, and the fear of the Catholic religion infiltrating the Protestant heritage and the Pope directing papal doctrine, drove their reasoning. A little over 100 years later, some American voters feared that the American way of life was being threatened by both white and black youths who were protesting against inequality and the war in Vietnam. The views of these Wallace supporters were reinforced by images on their televisions of youngsters burning the American flag along with inner-city neighborhoods burning to the ground. Many blue-collar Wallace supporters wondered aloud why this new generation lacked a sense of patriotism and duty to their country. Their anti-Catholicism and fear of immigrants taking their jobs had dissipated. Personal security, job security, and the country's security were now the Wallace supporters' aspirations. The Electoral College victory by Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election was a product of anti-Islam fear and hatred, the loss of jobs in manufacturing to foreign countries and the entrenchment of the welfare system. Blue-collar workers, both men and women, white-collar workers and professionals all feel their paychecks are being used to support people in America who are too lazy to find a job. Although this book focuses on the parallels of a triad of voters whose third-party causes coincided over a 100-year time period, the issues raised are not ones that should be left to conservative voters to resolve. The dispute over the United States welfare system will require the Democratic Party to have an honest dialogue among its own members. Once they do so, the next step will be to do so with the American people if they want to win back some of those white, blue-collar Wallace supporters who seem to mirror the Trump supporters. Today's Trump voter also feels the anger that terrorism has wrought not only in the United States, but across the world. ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban have perpetrated horrific acts of violence on innocent people, pushing Americans towards an anti-Islamic stance and a negative opinion of American Muslims. Unfortunately, fear of the unknown has driven a hatred of all Muslims among some American voters, no matter if these Muslims are American citizens. As a candidate, Donald Trump vowed to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. This gave a green light to some of his supporters to bring their prejudice into the open. It became acceptable to show this prejudice at rallies, on videos, via text messages, or in any other form in which they could share their feelings at a moment's notice. The new media barrage is now signing up converts within a matter of minutes with news stories, emails, and donation pages. Trying to combat falsehoods and propaganda in today's world is becoming much too difficult. The battle of technological campaigning touched on briefly in this book could be the topic itself of a separate book. By the time this book is released, the first year of the Trump presidency will be completed. We as a nation are anxious not only for the coming year, but for the decade that will follow. Both sides of the political spectrum will claim victories, but neither side will be quick to claim defeat. Neither side can afford to lose. The 2020 presidential election will be fought through the media outlets. The 2016 presidential election was proof that many truths will be ignored and false accusations will be embraced as truths as far as the headwinds will take them across the country. The American voter has become a spectacle within a circle of reality that academia will have a hard time infiltrating. The attack on the media by President Trump has become a daily morning briefing. The days of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein have ended. The polarization of the American voter has enabled the President of the United States to attack the media, a necessity for democracy to survive, furthering the divisions between the political left and right. The questioning of the President of the United States by the free press has occurred since George Washington. News articles both 9. Supporting the President and finding fault with him have constantly appeared. No president has been exempted from vicious attacks from one side or the other. Since the days of Watergate and the exposure of the criminality of the Nixon White House, criticism of presidential administrations has only become more intense. If a democracy loses its free press, especially the critical investigative arm, the grand experiment will end. Let's remember that the American citizens will be the ones to decide the extent of how long our democracy survives by its support of a free press regardless of who is President of the United States. Introduction. Chapter 2. The Original Know-Nothings. Abstract. To truly understand our country's politics and presidential outcomes, it is important to examine past elections with similarly divisive campaign issues. The election of 2016 has brought into the open the feelings of anxiety, hatred, and divisiveness towards Muslims and other minorities. Unfortunately, this chapter of our political history has been played out before in the 1856 presidential election. The American Party, or as is it better known the Know-Nothing Party, was anti-immigration and anti-Catholic. And leading the ticket in 1856 was a former President Millard Fillmore. Keywords: Know-Nothing 2016 presidential election, anti-Catholicism, anti-immigration. November 8, 2016 saw the revival of a political party that lay dormant in the pages of American history for more than 170 years, the American Party, or as it is commonly referred to in American high school and university history classes, the Know-Nothing Party. The notion that Donald Trump could ever become the Republican Party nominee, let alone the 45th President of the United States, seemed to many political pundits ridiculous in the summer of 2015 and then again in the summer of 2016. The idea of a political party blatantly devoted to anti-immigration and anti-Catholicism in the 1840s, reaching its apex in 1856 with the former 12th president heading its presidential ticket, also seems ridiculous. However, one of these two elements of the Know-Nothing platform has roared back with a nativist enthusiasm that was captured by the Republican Party in 2016. It would not be fair to say that the new anti-immigration fervor appeared within the past 2 years with the rise of Donald Trump. September 11, 2001, when 3,000 lives were taken in New York, Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, was when the United States was awakened to the terrorism with which dozens of countries across the planet live daily. The tragedy of September 11 can never be forgotten. The men that carried out this heinous act were from four nations: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Lebanon. An introduction to the know-nothings is covered in this chapter. For some readers, this will be a refresher on a part of history they once learned and soon forgot. For others this will be their first exposure to a movement that might seem either incredibly naive or a justified reaction at a time in our country's youth characterized by growing pains filled with paranoia. Either way, the know-nothing movement is coming back in part to our nation at lightning speed. An examination of the Know-Nothing Party was written in 1905, some 60 years after the movement had reached the heights of its popularity. Its author, Humphrey J. Desmond, took a prophetic look at what drove many Americans to the know-nothings. The rise of immigration from Europe in the 1840s had inspired an underlying feeling of nativism or, as Desmond states, dislike of European immigrants on the account of their birth. The influx of immigrants was also becoming a challenge to the predominant English and Scottish Protestants that were the foundation of the colonial beginnings. Nativism was growing, and Desmond pointed to the reason. More than a third of the immigrants for the decades ending 1830 and 1840 were from Ireland, and nearly one half of the 1,700,000 who landed from 1841 to 50 were Irish. More than a half, and probably nearly 3/5, of the immigrants up to 1860 were Catholics. 3. Slavery and the question of states' rights had begun to occupy more of the nation's political debate, beginning with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Federalist Party had faded into history, with the National 13. Republican Party taking its place for two elections in 1828 and 1832. The Whigs were left to challenge the age of Jackson, which took center stage by 1828 with the leadership and subsequent election of Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Nativism was already deeply rooted in many voters' minds, but was mainly concentrated in the eastern cities where many immigrants were settling. Anger towards foreigners was not yet a ballot box issue, such as was the battle over the national bank or the use of federal money for internal improvements within individual states. For now, the fear remained confined to local towns and cities, but it was waiting to blow up into a national issue. The two-pronged platform espoused by the Know-Nothings, consisting of nativism and anti-Catholicism, can be replaced today with the mantra of "Make America Great Again" and the distrust, and in many instances hatred, of Islam having replaced anti-Catholicism. The United States has reached another turning point in its history. The immigration battle taking place in 2017 mirrors that of the 1850s, at the height of the anti-immigration movement. Americans were scared in 1856 of losing a way of life that had been so delicately weaved together by the Founding Fathers. This sentiment has reappeared among the middle class in Midwestern states such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all states won by Donald Trump. The loss of jobs to foreign competition, a religion some people don't understand, terror attacks across the world, and a United States welfare system that has become synonymous with minority giveaways have triggered a new nativism similar to that of the Know-Nothing Party some 170 years ago. One of the most intriguing stories intertwined with the history of the American Party is the fact that a former president of the United States, Millard Fillmore, ran as an American Party candidate on a platform promoting hatred and prejudice. Fillmore is discussed in more detail in Chap 3. Opportunities to quote the Founding Fathers are never in short supply, as their words fit into today's political debates. George Washington weighed in on foreign strangers coming to the shores of the newly formed 13 colonies 4 years before being chosen as their first president. Washington's address referred to the Irish that had just recently arrived in the city of New York. The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions. The original Know-Nothings. 14. Whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment. 4. A native order of history. The Order of United Americans to the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner was a prelude to one of the most significant political movements in the history of the United States democracy, the Know Nothing Party. The small but dedicated group of nativists began organizing to protect the idea of English Protestant ideals by discriminating against Catholics. This religious discrimination was directed at an even narrower group, the Irish. These small political cells began in large cities in America, including Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. In colonial times, many states, such as North Carolina, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, passed legislation to ensure that Catholics would not be able to hold office. One of the first documented violent acts against Irish Catholics happened in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1834 when a convent was burned down by a mob. Rumors of nuns being held against their will and receiving harsh punishment were rampant. Nativists' paranoia was fueled by the written account of Rebecca Teresa Reed, who spent 6 months in the convent, and by the departure of a music teacher, Elizabeth Harrison, for 24 hours from the Charlestown convent. Harrison returned to the convent, citing mental exhaustion, but her sudden need to leave for a view of the outside world fed into the nativists' suspicions of abrasive Catholic practices. The influx of Irish immigrants settling in many northeastern states not only increased the fear among nativists about the potential loss of Native American majorities, but also threatened to encroach on the various Protestant religions that had been the young democracy's theological pillars. Roman Catholics were demanding that the King James Version of the Bible not be taught in the public schools, putting more fear into the hearts of native-born citizens. The Native American Association met in Germantown, Pennsylvania in 1837 to create a preamble and constitution. The following is part of their constitution. While, at the same time, we invite the stranger, worn down by oppression at home, to come and share with us the blessings of our native land here, find an asylum for his distress, and partake of the plenty a kind providence had so bountifully given us, we deny his right to have a voice in our legislative halls, his eligibility to office under any circumstances, and we ask a repeal of that naturalization law, which, it must be apparent to every reflecting mind, to every true son of America, has now become an evil. 7. The naturalization law that the Native American Association refers to in its constitution is the Naturalization Act of 1790. This act specified that any alien, being a free white person, could apply for citizenship, so long as he or she lived in the United States for at least 2 years, and in the state where the application was filed for at least a year. The new law also provided that children of citizens of the United States that may be born out of the limits of the United States shall be considered as natural-born citizens. 8. The Act would be amended in 1795 by Congress to make the requirement for residency 5 years. Even before the Native American Association was formed in 1837, anti-immigrant views were firmly entrenched in one of the first 2 organized political parties, the Federalist Party. President John Adams, elected in 1796, was fervently anti-French in terms of the revolutionary ideas coming out of France, which was at odds with the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. The fear of radical ideas being imported by immigrants arriving in the newly formed United States set the stage for the Federalists' Alien and Sedition Acts. There were 4 parts to this bill, passed and signed into law by President Adams in 1798-9. The Naturalization Act, which changed the term of residency required to become a naturalized citizen from 5 to 14 years, the Alien Friends Act, which authorized the President to deport foreigners deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States during peacetime, the Alien Enemies Act, which allowed the President to arrest, imprison, and deport any foreigner subject to an enemy nation, the Sedition Act, as it was known, which declared activities such as opposing or resisting any law of the United States, or any act of the President of the United States, and publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the President or the Congress to be high misdemeanors, punishable by fine and imprisonment. As President of the United States, John Adams, along with his Federalist Party, predated the Know Nothing Party in the opinion that certain the original Know Nothings 16. Grants coming to the United States were not welcome because of their native homeland and assumed radical ideology. John Adams was the first sitting president to address the issue of immigration, but not the last. Fears of the newly established American style of democracy being hijacked by an immigrant wave came fast and early as a divisive political issue in the country. The Federalists knew that many immigrants coming to America were supporters of the Democratic-Republican Party. In order to keep their power, the Federalists did not want to wait for Democratic elections to determine their future. It was as if the Federalists were saying, if we can't beat you by the vote, we will beat you by limiting those who can. However, England had lifted its anti-Catholic penal laws in 1790, allowing Catholics to come to the United States and making the nativists' task of Protestant control even more difficult. Although the Federalists were able to pass laws to hamper immigration, they did not stand for long. Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic-Republican followers would win the presidential election of 1800 and negate the Federalist anti-immigration laws, as 3 of the 4 laws were only valid under the Adams administration. The only law to survive from the 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts was the Alien and Enemies Act. Unfortunately, President Franklin Roosevelt used this law immediately after Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt signed Proclamation 2525 in accordance with the Alien Enemies Act, giving the government the authority to detain enemy aliens and confiscate enemy property. The proclamation permitted immediate apprehension of alien enemies deemed dangerous to the public health or safety of the United States by the Attorney General or Secretary of War. 10. Before returning to the discussion of the Know Nothing Party, an interesting article written in August 2016 demonstrates how the fear of immigrants has never gone out of fashion for American politicians when looking for a divisive issue. Various speeches made by then-candidate Donald Trump expressed very similar ideas to those behind the Alien and Sedition Acts. Once again, the focus was on the Alien and Enemies Act. Here is Donald Trump on August 15, 2016. As soon as I take office, I will ask the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security to identify a list of regions where adequate screening cannot take place. We will stop processing visas from those areas until such time as it is deemed safe to resume based on new circumstances or new procedures. 11. 17. The steady progression of anti-immigration attitudes increased with each decade and did not end with the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party's demise came about in part due to its fierce opposition to the War of 1812 with Great Britain, leading some Federalists to even speak of secession from the Union. Rufus King was the last Federalist candidate for president, losing badly in 1816 to Democratic-Republican James Monroe. Factions from the Federalist Party began looking for a place to go within the political system of the United States. Many would look to political movements such as the Native American Association. The Philadelphia riots of 1831 and 1844. The fear and paranoia regarding Irish Catholics dating back to the early 1800s has been well documented throughout American history. Numerous laws were passed early on in all 13 colonies to ban Catholics from holding office. The burning down of an Irish Catholic convent at Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1834 reflected the violence Philadelphia witnessed in 1831 and then again in 1844. These tragedies were pitting nativists against foreigners and Protestants against Catholics. One of the future platforms of the Know Nothings was an open secret in Boston, New York and Philadelphia. A Protestant parade of some 400 people on July 12, 1831 through Philadelphia to celebrate the Protestant victory in the Battle of the Boyne by William of Orange over James II, establishing Protestant control in Ireland, was watched by over 1,000 Catholic bystanders. 12. Anger on both sides led to a riot in which many people were injured. Prior to the early 1800s, many of the Irish coming to Philadelphia were Protestant. This trend began to change by the mid-1800s. A collision course between different religious views and stereotypes of Irish behavior degraded civility and led to violence. 3 months after the riots in Philadelphia, a trial was set for those arrested for taking part in the violence. 16 Catholics and 4 Protestants were put on trial for their part in the riots. In the end, 19 of the 20 were found guilty by the jury, and most were sentenced to 1 month of jail time. Protestant Alderman Britton Evans, found to be the main organizer of the Orangeman March as a member of the Orange Order, received 4 months. 13 The idea of organizing and participating in the march through the streets of Philadelphia in celebration of the Protestant faith was at the heart. The original Know-Nothings. 18. Of the trial, freedom of speech, as the Protestant participants argued, and inciting violence through intimidation, cried the Catholic parade watchers. In the end, the violence from both sides, and what the jury decided more than 180 years ago, is captured eloquently by Francis Hober. While the riot challenged public order, the trial and its aftermath sought to neutralize that challenge by casting Philadelphia as an American community in which values of mutuality, reciprocity, and cooperation prevailed among the populace, and were to be enforced by the power of the law if need be. The values affirmed by the events included, in addition to community and civility, mutual respect for differences between people, free expression, and religious and ethnic tolerance. 14. 13 years later the lessons of equality and respect were forgotten by those wanting not just a separate society based on religion, but the sanctuary of no diversity. Kensington, an area of Philadelphia located near the Delaware River, was the setting for a clash between nativist Americans and the Irish on May 3, 1844. A meeting of approximately 300 people to organize an association of Native Americans, according to one account written some 60 years after the event, was interrupted by a mob of Irishmen. 15 When the nativist Americans met again 3 days later, violence broke out, resulting in 2 dead, including the 18-year-old nativist George Schiffler. The death of Schiffler became fodder for the nativist movement. Over the next 2 days the Pennsylvania militia was called in to control the warring sides. Only after 2 Catholic churches along with a Catholic seminary were burned down by the nativists on May 8, and additional military and police forces were deployed, did the rioting end. However, the underlying hatred between nativists and Irish Catholics was never quelled. In July, after hearing about a priest's brothers stockpiling weapons in the basement of a Catholic church in a district south of Philadelphia called Southwark, a group of nativists marched on the church and demanded the weapons. On July 7 a battle was fought between the Philadelphia militia and nativist partisans for hours, leaving scores dead on both sides. The riots that took place in Kensington were not a surprise. While some of the violence had been spontaneous, the ambitions of the nativist newspapers and political party in an election year likely sustained. 19. Nativist fury through the spring and summer. Though the riots were more than the simple transplantation of anti-Catholic violence from Northern Ireland, they echoed the deliberate provocation seen there. 16. The distinction between the Irish and Catholicism was impossible to recognize for the Protestant majority. The Irish were Catholic and the Catholics were Irish. Henceforth, Protestant organizations began to grow in number and were concentrated in the large cities of the Northeast. The Protestant Reformation Society and American Protestant Union in New York and the Protestant Beneficial Association in Philadelphia were formed in the 1840s. The growth of Protestant associations invoked the brotherhood mentality Protestants were urgently trying to convey to the Catholics in their communities. If forming associations was not enough to spread their message of Protestant rule by controlling immigration, a tried and true method of communication was now being employed: newspapers and journals. Lynn Bridgers points out in her work, The American Religious Experience, A Concise History, that Protestants began to use more sophisticated arguments against Catholicism. 17 articles touting the Protestant objective were steeped in theological arguments aimed at pastors, encouraging them to speak out about the political influence Irish Catholic immigrants were attempting to gain. Protestant leaders attempted to secure their Anglo-Saxon heritage by educating the young about the commonality of Protestantism. Pulling a thread on the blanket of education. As Protestants and Catholics prayed at separate buildings of worship, children being educated in the same building would become one of the cornerstones of Protestant vs. Catholic debate that helped to incite the riots in Philadelphia. Public schools, also known originally as common schools, were first established by the colonists in the early 1600s with the founding of the Boston Latin School in 1635. 18 girls were not taught alongside boys in public schools at the time. The public schools were dominated by Protestant teachings and theology. The King James Bible was also used as a teaching tool, infuriating Catholics who were being forced to accept Protestant domination in all aspects of education. The Puritans were concerned that as immigrants kept reaching the shores of New England, their teachings would be put in jeopardy. After all, 20. Public education from the beginning was deeply rooted in the religious doctrine of strict adherence taught by the Puritans. The arrival of new immigrants who were not of English ancestry or of a Puritan faith were looked upon as a threat. This included the Irish Catholics and Jews. Joel Spring wrote that one of the reasons for the creation of the public schools was the Anglo-Saxon Protestants' deeply rooted fear of their dwindling majority. The common school movement of the 1830s and 1840s was, in part, an attempt to halt the drift toward a multicultural society. Self-proclaimed protectors of Protestant Anglo-American culture worried about the Irish immigrants streaming ashore, the growing numbers of enslaved African Americans, and the racial violence occurring in northern cities between freed Africans and whites. 19. The focus of nativists' fear of immigrants from faraway lands in Europe shifted from religious insecurity to the demands for equality in the classroom from Catholics. Public education then moved into the political arena in states such as New York. William Seward, one of the founders of the Whig Party along with Thurlow Weed in the 1830s, was elected governor of New York twice, in 1838 and 1840. Seward was an Episcopalian who was progressive in thought and actions. Seward favored internal improvements and public support of Catholic schools, and began to favor free soil and abolition positions. 20. All of these issues were key to the development of and debate within the young United States. However, the anger directed at Governor Seward was perhaps due most to his support for public state monies going to Catholic education. Seward was well aware of the Protestant vs. Catholic riots that had invoked religious autonomy in the cities of Philadelphia and Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1831 and 1834 respectively. Local politics over the previous 50 years, especially in the states of New England, had been focused on preventing Irish Catholics from holding office, while the federal government had been focused on controlling who came into the United States and extending the years of residency required to become a U.S. citizen. Control of public education in New York was in the hands of the Public School Society. Its members determined the allocation of the 21. Common School Fund allocated from the state of New York. Ascribing to its definition of sectarian, the Public School Society funded schools that were generically Christian. 21. Now, the governor of New York was himself intervening not just on the question of the quality of education, but on equality between the two major religions. The anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic Whig element in New York politics felt betrayed by Governor Seward's seemingly compassionate new attitude towards Catholic education. There was also the fact that as governor, Seward was open to the pleas and cajoling of the Bishop of New York, John Hughes. Patrick Young points out that William Seward was ahead of his time as both a Whig Party member and a politician in the 1830s. New York State Governor William Seward was a rare Whig politician. While many members of the Whig Party were harshly anti-immigrant, Seward, who would later serve as Lincoln's Secretary of State, met regularly with German and Irish leaders and worked to understand the problems of new immigrants. 22. Seward's show of independence in an era of anti-immigration and anti-Catholicism, especially in a state such as New York, was a profile in courage. Seward's efforts were not just about getting out the vote. His concern for the integration of various groups of immigrants is worthy of study in today's anti-immigration climate. In the end, the New York State Legislature did pass a bill effectively ending the Public School Society's monopoly on New York's public education. However, oversight of public education then moved to local control, with Protestant-dominated school boards. 23. The arrival of the Know-Nothings. As Irish immigrants came to the United States in larger numbers between 1845 and 1850, the Irish that had come to America previously, as we have seen, had posed enough of a threat to the nativist Americans for an ensuing national movement to materialize. Irish, German, Scandinavian, and even some Jewish immigrants were all part of the first and second waves of massive immigration to the United States from 1790 to 1820 and 1820 to 1860 respectively. The Protestant, mainly English, majority could see that the most effective way of retaining their future existence was through the democratic process. The tumultuous years from 1831 to 1844, witnessing anti-immigrant riots in the various large cities of the Northeast, led to the first national convention of the American Party in July 1845 at the Assembly Buildings in Philadelphia. Delegates represented 14 states, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri, Mississippi, Georgia, New Hampshire, Vermont, Indiana, and North Carolina. 24 The ideas put forth by the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention were a prelude to the Know-Nothing Party that would eventually capture the imagination of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Then known as the Native American Party, the convention declared, "We, the delegates elect the first national convention of the Native American body of the United States of America, assembled at Philadelphia, on the 4th of July, AD 1845, for the purpose of devising a plan of concerted political action in defense of American institutions against the encroachments of foreign influence, open or concealed, hereby solemnly, and before Almighty God, make known to our fellow citizens, our country, and the world, the following incontrovertible facts, and the course of conduct consequent thereon, to which, in duty to the cause of human rights and the claims of our beloved country, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." 25. Of course, there were many detractors to what the Nativist American Party was advocating, including a rebuttal by Thomas L. Nichols of New York, a doctor, social historian, and journalist, to the Nativist American Party's anti-immigration views. Below is a small section of Nichols' defense, encouraging Americans to embrace immigrants from Europe because, as a nation, the United States was getting Europe's best. From the very nature of the case, America gets from Europe the most valuable of her population. Generally, those who come here are the very ones whom a sensible man would select. Those who are attached to monarchical and aristocratic institutions stay at home where they can enjoy them. Those who lack energy and enterprise can never make up their minds to leave their native land. It is the strong-minded, the brave-hearted, the free and self-respecting, the enterprising and the intelligent, who break away from all the ties of country and of home, and brave the dangers of the ocean, in search 23. Of liberty and independence, for themselves and for their children, on a distant continent, and it is from this, among other causes, that the great mass of the people of this country are distinguished for the very qualities we should look for in emigrants. 26. As immigration fueled much of American Protestant anger, the spread of American interests to the West began to take away the momentum of the Nativist American Party. The Democratic Party and the Whig Party would debate with deep fervor the legality of the Mexican War in which American blood was being spilled near a disputed area near the Rio Grande. With the two major parties already divided over the Mexican War in 1846, the resentment over Protestant control of immigration, especially among those of non-Protestant denomination, showed in the U.S. Army. A group of 200 Irish fighters sided with the Mexican Army against the U.S. Army due to the U.S. government's anti-immigrant stance towards the Irish. The defection of the Irish was due to the fact that the Mexican government was willing to offer newly arrived Irish Catholics food, shelter, and a new country to pledge allegiance to, the chance to fight against invasion by the Protestant U.S. 27 after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848 between the Mexican government and the United States to end the conflict. 525,000 square miles of territory fell into the hands of the young democracy. as members of the Nativist American Party were trying to gain power in state legislatures in order to pass laws curtailing immigrants' roles in government decisions, their task became much more difficult with the acquisition of this new territory. The debate over slavery also heated up after the term of Democrat President James K. Polk ended in 1849 and Whig nominee and Mexican war hero General Zachary Taylor was elected, along with Millard Fillmore of New York as his running mate. Within 16 months of taking the oath as vice president, Fillmore would become the 13th president of the United States after the sudden death of President Taylor on July 9, 1850. In the era of debate over slavery and states' rights, Fillmore would not only sign the fugitive slave law condemning runaway slaves to a lifetime of indignity and pain, but he would agree to be the face of anti-immigration and anti-Catholicism. The Native American Party would soon acquire the infamous name by which it is known in history books, the Know-Nothing Party. Chapter 3. Our 13th President now a Know-Nothing. Abstract of the 44 men who have served in the Oval Office, only 3 former presidents have run for an additional term after leaving office. Along with the first, Martin Van Buren in 1848, and one of the greatest, Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, was Millard Fillmore's third party run as the Know-Nothing candidate in 1856. Some presidential historians have questioned why Fillmore would have accepted the nomination of a party steeped in anti-Catholicism and anti-immigration. Others have praised Fillmore for his courage in bringing the spirit of the American Revolution back to the United States. Some of these questions are addressed in this chapter. Keywords: Millard Fillmore 1856 Presidential election. Slavery. What drove former President Millard Fillmore to accept the nomination of the Know-Nothing Party in 1856, 3 years after leaving the presidency? The Whig Party that Fillmore belonged to for over 25 years was dissolving into the pages of political party history propelled by the issue of slavery. Fillmore was Zachary Taylor's vice president in 1848 and was considered a conservative Whig. When Taylor died unexpectedly in the summer of 1850, Fillmore became the nation's 13th president. Taylor left Fillmore with a nation entrenched in the sufferings of the slavery debate and westward expansion. 28. As a Northern Whig born in New York, Fillmore was not exactly an expert on the issue of slavery, and he decided in 1850 to go along with Senator Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850, which included the controversial fugitive slave law. The law required that any slave caught in any United States territory be brought back to their rightful owner. Clay's Compromise Bill also included 5 statutes enacted in September of 1850, all stemming from territory gained in the Mexican War. The acts called for the admission of California as a free state, provided for a territorial government for Utah and New Mexico, established a boundary between Texas and the United States, called for the abolition of slave trade in Washington, D.C., and amended the Fugitive Slave Act. 1. Northern voters and their political representatives were outraged by the introduction of the bill itself and by the Northerner president that signed it into law. Fillmore had critically damaged his chances for renomination as a Whig. Millard Fillmore was caught in the vile clutches of slavery and decided that not stirring up Southern anger was his only option to save the Union. The Miller Center at the University of Virginia, which specializes in the study of the presidency, said this of Fillmore's motivation to sign the Fugitive Slave Bill on September 18, 1850. Fillmore personally opposed slavery but signed the Fugitive Slave Law for 2 reasons. First, he believed the South would secede if its demands, including a fugitive slave law, were not met. Second, Fillmore believed he could use the compromise to unite the Whig Party behind a single national platform. Fillmore, a Whig from New York, tried to press other Northern Whigs to support the compromise and the fugitive slave law. He worked to prevent Northern Whigs who opposed the fugitive slave law from winning elections and used his patronage powers to appoint pro-fugitive slave law political allies to federal office. While Fillmore's support for the Compromise of 1850 helped stall the Southern secessionist movement, his efforts to unite the Whigs behind the compromise failed, in large part because of the fugitive slave law. Anti-slavery Whigs, who thought the law unjust, refused to support Fillmore for president in the 1852. The fugitive slave law, moreover, only deepened existing, and eventually fatal, divides within the Whig Party over slavery. 2. Fillmore's decision to run for a full term of his own was not based on a desire for self-aggrandizement. The Whig Party was splintering along the 29. fault line between North and South. President Fillmore was seen by many party leaders as the only candidate who could placate both sides. The leading candidates for the Whig nomination in 1852 besides President Fillmore were the legendary senator from Massachusetts Daniel Webster and Mexican War General Winfield Scott. Fillmore had a great deal of respect for Senator Webster, but Webster was in very fragile health. His chances of surviving the campaign, let alone a 4-year term, were a concern for the Whig leadership, who were contemplating their party's long-term survival. Fillmore's decision filled the party faithful with despair. From friends everywhere came pleas for a reconsideration. Scott actually supported the compromise, but his ties with Seward would render Scott anathema to the South, and Webster's age and health were irrevocable barriers. A severe defeat would destroy the Whigs as a national party and force a new realignment based upon attitudes toward slavery extension. The re-election of Fillmore was the party's only real hope, unless some other leader could keep the party conservative enough on slavery to continue to hold its Southern membership. 3. The ultimate vote at the Baltimore Whig Convention fell in favor of General Winfield Scott, angering the Southern Whigs. Scott had the support of Northern Whig and anti-slavery leader William Seward, former governor of New York and sitting senator of the same at the time of the convention in 1852. Southern Whigs' loathing of Seward was similar to Southern voters' feelings toward Democrat George McGovern at the time of his run for the presidency in 1972. Whig Party nominee Winfield Scott lost the presidential election of 1852 to Democrat Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. Scott won only 4 states: Vermont, Massachusetts, Kentucky, and Tennessee, for a total of 42 electoral votes. Scott garnered 44% of the popular vote to Pierce's 51%. Free Soil candidate John Hale managed only 5% of the popular vote, half of the vote former President Martin Van Buren received as the Free Soil candidate in 1848. As the reader may have noticed in the previous paragraph, a former president decided to run for president once more after losing his re-election bid. Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, won election in 1836 as the Democratic Party nominee following Andrew Jackson. However, Van Buren's campaign for a second term ended in 30. defeat against Whig William Henry Harrison in 1840. Being only one of 3 former presidents to run for the presidency again as a third-party candidate is worth a quick examination. Slavery and states' rights were the 2 issues at the heart of Van Buren's decision to run once more as the Free Soil Party candidate in 1848. The Free Soil Party met in Buffalo, New York on August 9 to 10, 1848. Among the various planks in the platform was the feeling that neither of the 2 major parties, Democrats or Whigs, would give people their own choice when it came to slavery in the newly acquired territory from the Mexican War. Resolved, that slavery in the several states of this union which recognize its existence depends upon the state law alone, which cannot be repealed or modified by the federal government, and for which laws that government is not responsible. We therefore propose no interference by Congress with slavery within the limits of any state. 4. Resolved, that the true and, in the judgment of this convention, the only safe means of preventing the extension of slavery into territory now free is to prohibit its extension in all such territory by an act of Congress. 5. Van Buren's nomination as the Free Soil candidate incorporated members of the Liberty Party from 1844 and its nominee, James G. Birney. Whigs who were opposed to slavery and its expansion also joined the Free Soil movement. As with so many third-party movements after Van Buren's 1848 bid, the members of the Free Soil Party filtered back into the Democratic Party and the soon-to-be Republican Party. The historic contribution of the Whig Party to the development and debate of American democracy ended with the Scott defeat. As in my other books, The mental exercise of asking the what-if questions is applicable here to the 1852 presidential election. What if Millard Fillmore had captured the Whig nomination instead of Winfield Scott? Would he have been able to keep enough Northern Whigs to win? If Fillmore had won, would the Whig Party have made the Republican Party obsolete? Would the sore of slavery have continued to fester for the 4-year term of Fillmore? As a writer of politics, the exercise of exploring all facets of a presidential election from the perspective of the winner and of the runner-up is worth the reader's time. It is the goal of this book to take the reader back to that time to feel the passion and anger and to see the underlying basis of a political movement. 31. The loss by Winfield Scott in a sense freed President Fillmore of the burden of shouldering the blame for the Whig Party's demise. We already know that a Fillmore nomination would have prevented the loss of the Southern Whig political vote for at least another 4 years. However, the lid was blowing off the proverbial Northern/Southern pot filled with the ingredients of animosity, cultural schism, and historical distrust. It is doubtful that a Fillmore 4-year term would have diffused the civil unrest given his previous actions, mainly his controversial support of the fugitive slave law. Like most presidents who preceded him and those who followed, Fillmore was ready to retire quietly in Buffalo. However, personal tragedy struck just 3 weeks after his term ended. Fillmore's wife of 27 years, Abigail, died on March 30, 1853 after developing pneumonia. Abigail's death consigned the grieving Fillmore to an alternative path of historic reputation. The now ex-president of the United States would spend the next 3 years becoming the embodiment of a country divided not only between slave and free state, but also immigrant versus nativism. And, of course, there was the Protestant vs. Catholicism faction thrown in for good measure. Besides the deep split during the Civil War, the divisions in the United States between the years 1854 and 1860 were more numerous than in any other year until 1968. The election of Franklin Pierce over Scott in 1852 only invited greater loathing between the Northern and Southern politicians. President Pierce signed into law the Kansas, Nebraska Act of 1854 repealing the Compromise of 1820 and also giving the idea of popular sovereignty to the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Violence broke out between anti-slavery and pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. Pierce sent federal troops into Topeka, Kansas to uphold the pro-slavery government over the anti-slavery forces. As the nation was heading closer to a civil war, the Whig Party was dissolving. Millard Fillmore would fill part of this political vacuum, as the American Party was on a different crusade from the pro- and anti-slavery debate. The formation of local clubs for the sole purpose of diminishing the influence of Catholics and immigrants from Europe began to grow in the late 1840s and early 1850s. The American and Foreign Christian Union, an alliance of 3 anti-Catholic societies, and the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner were just 2 of the anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant 32 societies growing mainly in the eastern states. 6. As Fillmore read of the Know-Nothing candidates' gains in the 1854 fall elections, his decision to be all-in as a Know-Nothing candidate himself was decided by early 1855. One of the ugliest episodes in the Know-Nothing movement occurred in Kentucky in 1855. In the months leading up to Kentucky's gubernatorial election of August 1855, George D. Prentice, the local editor of the Louisville Journal, ran several editorials that warned against the influence of the immigrant population and espoused the Know-Nothing platform, including a story that ran on the morning of the election in which he tried to convince Kentuckians that foreigners and Catholics were looking to infiltrate America through the vote. 7. Violence broke out at the voting polls on the morning of August 6, 1855 as Know-Nothing supporters beat, shot, lynched, stabbed and intimidated Irish and German immigrants as they tried to vote. Bloody Monday, as it became known, ended with a Know-Nothing governor and led to violence in other cities across the country. 8. Violence against those of different religions or colors would continue to be perpetrated by some Americans throughout the country's history, including in the 21st century. The first female national campaign manager, One of the Know-Nothing's most ardent supporters was Anna Ella Carroll. Carroll had been a supporter of President Zachary Taylor and Vice President Millard Fillmore. She could be compared to a modern-day campaign manager, as she encouraged Fillmore to tour Europe, which he did from March to June 1855. Carroll knew Fillmore was interested in the Know-Nothing Party, so she began to position him as the favorite for the Know-Nothing nomination. 9. She would also go on to be one of America's true heroines of the 19th and 20th centuries, as she fought to save the Union along with President Abraham Lincoln. A small group of Carroll descendants and supporters, appropriately called the Friends of Anna Ella Carroll, who also partner with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, have done a thorough assessment of a woman not well known to the average American voter. Whether or not one agrees with all of Carroll's causes, she was a woman of unique leadership. 33. Carroll's main goals as an American party reformer were to maintain the Union, to end slavery and prevent slaveholders from establishing a pro-slavery state government, as a morally upright Presbyterian, to end corruption and bring civil order back to Baltimore, to support various improvement projects, such as the building of railroads and canals, and expansion of educational facilities. 10. The Friends of Anna Ella Carroll also described the Know-Nothing Party platform and the evolution of their views. Carroll had even written 2 books during the 1856 presidential campaign in support of Fillmore and the Know-Nothing Party, called The Great American Battle, or, The Contest Between Christianity and Political Romanism, and The Star of the West. These views may contradict other historians' interpretations of the goals of the Know-Nothings, but they are worth noting. Overall, 2 key domestic issues in contention were slavery and public school funding. And internationally, liberals opposed the efforts of the Vatican to ally with anti-republican monarchists who hoped to regain regimes, notably Emperor Napoleon III of France. American party candidates also campaigned to protect the jobs of native workingmen, that included free blacks. Further, the rapid urban influx of immigrants created widespread crime and corruption, including during elections. In Baltimore alone, between 1849 and 1854, crime rose 40%. One of the main goals of the American Party was to clean up crime and corruption. 11. The nomination of Millard Fillmore for president and Andrew Jackson Donaldson of Tennessee for vice president on the Know-Nothing ticket was acknowledged with excitement by Carroll. Here is Carroll's letter to Fillmore, written on February 28, 1856, 10 days after the Know-Nothing Party met in Philadelphia. Holdridge's Hotel. 12. Corner Clinton. Place and Buay. N.Y. February 28, 56. My dear friend. With this will be hand to you the official intelligence of your nomination to the presidency, by the American Party. I scarcely know how to express my gratification. This is earnest, heartfelt, 34. and sincere as the soul of woman can only feel. And I regard the hand of God as so marked and manifest in this connection, and in view of all the circumstances surrounding the case, as to believe that He has required this of the American people, as much so as He did Washington to lead our great revolutionary armies. It is a proud, a glorious compliment, deserved not less than appreciated by thyself. I was in Philadelphia by the advice of several distinguished friends, members of the convention. And being called upon by such, I was fully prepared for the result. I was to all else truly a know-nothing, and it was amusing to behold the generous lender of service and the calls of the lawmen upon me. For several weeks they had attempted to propitiate me, when I refused to have any opinion or preference to express. I wrote the enclosed pamphlet, which is a profound secret, but which so far diminished the vote, being read and disseminated through the convention, as to be termed His Life and Death, My Battle. 13. They say, Mr. Bartlett N.C. shall be the textbook of the cause, and just as it was issuing, has been stayed to make room for a chapter on the nominations by their advice, otherwise I could send you a copy by the steamer. Major Donaldson is to be here in a few minutes, and is exceedingly anxious to have his likeness in the next edition. I have been also requested to write a campaign pamphlet, and have a prospectus out for the biographies and portraits of prominent Americans of the party, for the lesser lights. I was interrupted by company as I was writing last night, and among them Major Donaldson, who stayed long enough and talked just enough to satisfy me as to his caliber. Verily the days of Jackson have returned, and his relative is poised on his winged steed. Trusting in God there will be no occasion to try the gentleman in the White House. I believe this the wisest and most available choice which could have been made to steal Democratic thunder. The papers represent you as well, and C. I now rejoice you are in Europe, that this matter has seemed and is without any effect, unsought and unsolicited in any way whatever. I am delightfully situated here, and Mrs. Holdridge, who takes good care of me, seems to worship the Fillmore name and is one of your female advocates. Let me hear from you and know if you read my last, and when you will be at home. Ever most truly yours, Anna Ella Carroll. 35. The excitement expressed by Anna Ella Carroll about Fillmore's candidacy was further demonstrated in her book A Review of Pierce's Administration, showing its only popular measures to have originated with the executive of Millard Fillmore, written in 1856. The significance of Carroll's gender to her opinion on politics was not lost on her. Some may think that it is not the province of a woman to enter on the rough path of a political critic, or to presume to discuss subjects which belong to the other sex. The writer's answer to all remarks of this nature, that she knows of no rule to exclude females from society, or the discussion of any subject which has an immediate bearing on the social, moral, and political destiny of this nation. 14. Carroll's entry into the political arena of a male-dominated society did not muddle the anti-immigration and anti-Catholicism message of the Know-Nothing Party. Carroll's profound passion for Fillmore as her candidate for President of the United States was deep, sincere, and brazen. Follow on successively to Fillmore, and judge who possesses more suitable qualifications, more personal integrity, higher sense of national honor and patriotism, to fill the elevated office, after Washington, of the Chief Magistrate of the nation. The name of Fillmore will adorn the page of our American history, and be transmitted to posterity as one of the most successful and illustrious successors of Washington. 15. Carroll also attacks President Franklin Pierce throughout her book on issues including immigration, foreign policy, Mormonism, and of course Catholicism. The fear of Protestant domination being displaced by men such as the Episcopalian Pierce appeasing the Irish Catholics was summed up in her condemnation Pierce's words when taking the oath of office. When Mr. Pierce was called upon by the Chief Justice to swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, it is said he discarded the time-honored fashion of all our former presidents, and said, "I solemnly affirm," and instead of reverently kissing the blessed word, as all his predecessors had done, he merely raised his right hand and held it aloft, in the presence of the spectators, until the pledge was given. Thus his first act was an obsequiousness to the Romish hierarchy, to propitiate which he insulted the feelings of Protestants, who regard as sacred God's eternal book. 16. 36. The focus of Carroll and the Know-Nothing supporters was on the need to rally around the honor of the patriots that fought and shaped the United States in the English Protestant culture. They considered the large influx of Irish coming into the United States as the greatest threat to the honor of men such as Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Hancock, and Madison. The Know-Nothing Party, which would become the most organized political challenge in the first 50 years of the young nation, was all set with their platform and presidential candidate. 1856 Know-Nothing Party versus 2016 Republican Party. The introduction of Anna Ella Carroll touched on the Know-Nothing Party platform as shown in her writings. The Know-Nothing platform adopted on February 21, 1856 in Philadelphia included numerous references to resisting foreign influences and keeping America American. Americans must rule America, and to this end native-born citizens should be selected for all state, federal, and municipal offices of government employment, in preference to all others. Nevertheless, a change in the laws of naturalization, making a continued residence of 21 years, of all not heretofore provided for, an indispensable requisite for citizenship hereafter, and excluding all paupers, and persons convicted of crime, from landing upon our shores, but no interference with the vested rights of foreigners. Nearly 150 years later, the Republican Party would list immigration as one of their party's top concerns, as stated under the title of Immigration and the Rule of Law. America's immigration policy must serve the national interest of the United States, and the interests of American workers must be protected over the claims of foreign nationals seeking the same jobs. 17. This section goes on to discuss amnesty, terrorism, and building the infamous wall along the Mexican border. In a time of terrorism, drug cartels, human trafficking, and criminal gangs, the presence of millions of unidentified individuals in this country poses grave risks to the safety and sovereignty of the United States. Our highest priority, therefore, must be to secure our borders and all ports of entry and to enforce our immigration laws. 1837. Of course, this was not the only time that the platforms of a third party and one of the two major parties had equivalent goals. However, the Know-Nothing anti-immigrant platform at a time of increased immigration in the 1850s was comparable to the Republican platform of 2016 at a time of worldwide terrorism. A sense of alarm among those who saw a part of America turning foreign was enough for the Know-Nothing Party to gain 21% of the presidential vote in 1856. In 2016, some voters' alarm over immigration from Muslim countries was a theme capitalized on by Donald Trump, a message that contributed to Trump's 46% of the presidential vote and enough in the Electoral College to win the presidency. The immigrant threat in 1856, as seen by those in the Know-Nothing movement, was of the demise of an America started from a Protestant base and a moral fiber being undone by foreign drunkards. Religion was under threat from the papal dictator in Rome, and the ideal of hard work would be ignored by half-hearted foreigners whose allegiance was to their ancestry abroad. Know-Nothings believed their America was under siege from an enemy, both seen and unseen. Fast forward to 2016 and these very beliefs are shared by many Trump supporters. Now the foreign enemies are Muslims from countries known and unknown, and Islam has replaced Catholicism. Donald Trump's message, mainly directed toward the baby boomers and Generation X, is that the America the loved is under siege. And the problem now is much worse, because the Know-Nothing Party had to worry predominantly about Europe, while the Republican Party of 2016 has to worry about approximately 193 nations. Fear of the unknown has more often than not driven political decisions. The year 2016 was no different. The comparison between 1856 and 2016 has not been lost on the national media and presidential historians. James Navius wrote in August 2015, a full 9 months before Trump would capture the Republican nomination, that a Fillmore/Trump connection was looming if Donald Trump decided to run as a third-party candidate. Like Donald Trump's campaign today, the Know-Nothings appealed to those who saw native-born Americans losing out to immigrants. The second plank of the 1856 party platform was Americans must rule America. 19. Navius continued with a prediction that was cryptic, but a little off. If Donald Trump becomes the Millard Fillmore of 2016 with his own third-party run, it seems more than likely that no matter who the Republicans and 38 Democrats end up nominating, the Democrat will win and the Know-Nothing's obvious heir will have served as the spoiler. 20. The nominee and his defeat. Millard Fillmore was in Paris when he sent the following message after hearing of his nomination as the Know-Nothing candidate: "Gentlemen, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your letter, informing me that the National Convention of the American Party, which had just closed its session at Philadelphia, had unanimously presented my name for the presidency of the United States, and associated with it that of Andrew Jackson Donaldson for the vice presidency." 21. Fillmore also gave a shout-out to the formation of a third party, reminding the reader why the Know-Nothings were formed in the first place. As the proceedings of the convention have marked a new era in the history of the country. By bringing a new political organization into the approaching presidential canvass, I take occasion to reaffirm my full confidence in the patriotic purpose of that organization, which I regard as springing out of the public necessity forced upon the country to a large extent by unfortunate sectional divisions, and the dangerous tendency of those divisions towards disunion. 22. Fillmore's trip to Europe included a visit with Pope Pius IX. Even as anti-Catholicism was a cornerstone of the Know Nothing platform, Fillmore himself was not anti-Catholic. In fact, when Fillmore was asked a question about the Pope while campaigning in Philadelphia, he answered, "Some of my best friends are Catholic." 23. The anti-Catholic theme emphasized a specific part of the Know Nothing platform, but a greater theme ran deeper in the minds of Know Nothing politicians such as Fillmore. As he returned from his European tour and made his way back to his native New York, here is Fillmore at Newburgh, New York, addressing a crowd of supporters, intentionally demonstrating his belief that immigrants must not take over the American nativist country. "While I did this, I would, for the sake of those who seek an asylum on our shores as well as for our own sake, declare as a general rule that Americans 39 should govern America. I regret to say that men who come fresh from the monarchies of the old world are prepared neither by education, habits of thought, or knowledge of our institutions to govern Americans. The failure of every attempt to establish free government in Europe is demonstrative of this fact, and if we value the blessings which Providence has so bounteously showered upon us, it becomes every American to stand by the Constitution and laws of his country and to resolve that, independent of all foreign influence, Americans will and shall rule America." 24. The question arises, why would Millard Fillmore want to be a nominee of a third party based on discrimination? The answer is patriotism. The nomination of the Know Nothing Party was not something Fillmore was actively pursuing. They came to him. Fillmore wanted to be the candidate that would be able to unite the sectional break that had been widening since he left office. Fillmore was not naive, and he realized that his signing of the Compromise of 1850, which included the fugitive slave law, made him a pariah to both the North and the South. Here is Fillmore in a letter from September 29, 1856 to a gentleman in South Carolina. "In the North I am charged with being a pro-slavery man, seeking to extend slavery over free territory, and in the South, I am accused of being an abolitionist. But I am neither, and as I have invariably refused to give any pledge, other than such as might be inferred from my known character and previous official conduct, I have not answered to the public any of these charges." 25. The idea that the nation in 1856 needed a man with the ability to compromise meant that this was a leadership skill Millard Fillmore was said to possess. Supporters of the American Party heaped praise on Fillmore as the potential compromiser-in-chief. Now Mr. Fillmore has the support of many members of the Whig Party on the ground that he is a man of that moderation of temper who will reconcile the extremes of opinion on both sides. Nothing but harm can come, if this attitude of opposition and collision between the North and South is to continue. Millard Fillmore stands in the position of a man who takes that moderate part which is never tasteful to the American people. It is one of the characteristics of the people to favor extreme measures. Moderation, conciliation, and compromise, that class of qualities and that class of virtues is not taking to the common American mind. 26. 40. Millard Fillmore went to great lengths, as shown above, to convince himself that he did not favor either the North or the South during his term as president. Unfortunately for the country, Fillmore's threading the needle style of governing did just that with the ugliness of the fugitive slave law. Fillmore damaged any chance for his own 4-year term with the Northern Whigs, who did not like the idea of slave ownership, but were more concerned with national unity. The conscience Whigs in the state of Massachusetts only had the evil of slavery entrenched in their conscience, giving no support to the likes of Fillmore. And one must also remember that although many Northerners did not like slavery, their discrimination was still obvious. The divisions of the 1850s left politicians of Fillmore's era grasping for a solution that would lead to some type of immaculate sectional healing. However, what the country needed was not a Southern or Northern sympathizer, but a man with the courage to lead, founded on his belief in a united Union no matter the cost. This man would win the presidential election in 1860 and, as they say, the rest is history. The final results of the 1856 presidential election made James Buchanan of Pennsylvania the 15th President of the United States, with 45% of the popular vote. John Fremont of Western Expedition fame finished second as the first nominee of the newly formed Republican Party, with 33% of the popular vote. Millard Fillmore actually finished a strong third by today's standards for a third party by taking 21.54% of the popular vote. The most important total as prescribed by the Constitution is the Electoral College, where Fillmore learned the difficulties of a third-party run. He won only Maryland, with 8 electoral votes. Buchanan won 174 electoral votes, with Fremont finishing at a respectable 114. Interestingly, Northerner James Buchanan carried all of the South, leaving the North to Fremont and the new Republican Party. Buchanan would go on to most definitely satisfy the political appetite of the South. Where did the Know-Nothings eventually throw their support in the 1860 presidential election? Michael F. Holt examines this very question in 2 of his works, The Political Crisis of the 1850s and the Election of 1860. The presidential election of 1860 featured 4 candidates: Abraham Lincoln of Illinois as the Republican nominee, Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois as the Democratic Party nominee, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky representing the Southern Democrats, and John Bell of Tennessee as the Constitution Union nominee. 41. Realistically, the race was always between Lincoln and Douglas, with Bell's candidacy as the wild card of spoilers. Breckinridge was then vice president under Buchanan and would have continued the Buchanan presidency. Buchanan's pro-Southern sentiments are now embedded in his legacy, as he shunned Northern appeals for unionism to appease Southern fears of losing their human property. The common thread that weaves together the themes of the 1860 presidential election is slavery. However, another important factor driving Know-Nothing voters to the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln was the corruption in the Buchanan administration. Anger at Democratic corruption also trumped the fears of conservative former Whigs and Democrats that a Lincoln victory meant disunion. A friend of Crittenden explained after the election why he and other former Fillmore men in Connecticut did not support Bell as Crittenden had hoped. "Multitudes of us voted for the Republican ticket because we wanted honesty to displace corruption." 27. Another example Holt uses to illustrate the corruption under Buchanan is as follows: "I voted for Lincoln," the political economist David A. Wells told Tennessee's Andrew Johnson, "not because I hated slavery, or thought it a sin, or wished in any way to do my neighbor a wrong, but because I was disgusted with the present administration and wished for a change." 28. Where do the 4.5 million people who voted for Libertarian Gary Johnson go in the 2020 presidential election? Or the combined 2.2 million votes for Dr. Jill Stein of the Green Party and Independent Evan McMullin? And finally, one wonders about the 1.1 million write-in votes. These numbers don't add up to the large percentage Millard Fillmore garnered as the Know-Nothing candidate in 1856, but it is significant when one remembers the incredibly narrow victories Donald Trump posted in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. This brief but valuable background on the Know-Nothing movement that consumed much of the decade of the 1850s will be useful to the reader as they go forward in this book. The steady progression of anti-immigration movements in the 19th and 20th centuries built upon the Know-Nothing stance of nativism. Millard Fillmore was the first of a select few to actually lead an anti-immigration presidential ticket. The anti-immigration rhetoric of the American past has reared its ugly head once more in the 21st century. One former president lost his 42. Know-Nothing bid in a time of sectional violence. A Southern segregationist governor of Alabama lost his bid to sit in the Oval Office in light of the upheaval in the inner cities, and one billionaire former head of a reality show manipulated many Americans' fear so they would constantly disbelieve what the U.S. media reported and rode that fear all the way to the Oval Office. The American voter seems to have become the most blatant adversary of American democracy, and there is no end in sight. Any hope for the survival of the shining city upon a hill depends on the American voter getting the sun out of its eyes and going back down the hill to find a lost spirit. Chapter 4. Trump 68. Abstract November 8, 2016 is a date that will live in the hearts of voters across the United States for years. One's heart is either hardened with delight that the nation is taking a new course, or it has been broken by the belief that hatred has overcome progress. The voters in 2016 who were alive in 1968 might reflect back on that year's election, which was very divisive and filled with deep-rooted racial stereotypes. Leading the charge of this division and straight-talking, sharp-tongued language was Governor George Wallace of Alabama. This chapter will compare Wallace's 1968 base with that of Trump in 2016. Keywords: George Wallace, Donald Trump, 1968 presidential election, law and order. And in one rally after another, Wallace's angry rhetoric ignited fist-swinging, chair-throwing confrontations between these hardcore followers and anti-war and civil rights demonstrators, who on occasion pelted the candidate with various objects. Wallace was hit by rocks, eggs, tomatoes, pennies, a peace medallion, Tootsie Rolls, a sandal, and a miniature whiskey bottle. By October, television crews always set up two cameras, one to focus on the stage, the other to capture the melees and bloodied demonstrators in the audience. 1:46. This is a description of numerous George Wallace for President rallies in 1968, before the age of cell phones and 24-hour news channels, which appeared on the evening nightly news. The fiery speeches and controversial views of the governor of Alabama captured the support of a large chunk of the American electorate. How often are we taught that history repeats itself? I'd like to punch him in the face, waxing nostalgic for an era when protesters would be carried out on stretchers. We're not allowed to push back anymore, Trump rude. The day after an enthusiast threw a sucker punch at a demonstrator being led out of a Fayetteville, North Carolina event, Trump said, "The audience hit back. That's what we need a little more of." 2. Yes, this was the Republican nominee for president in 2016, Donald Trump. No doubt George Wallace felt the same way at times, and in fact Wallace said this himself at another rally. Why do the leaders of the two national parties kowtow to these anarchists? He demanded, gesturing toward the protesters in the balcony. One of them laid down in front of President Johnson's limousine last year. I tell you, when November comes, the first time they lie down in front of my limousine, it'll be the last one they'll ever lay down in front of. Their day is over. 3. Almost every political candidate for President of the United States has faced hecklers and protesters. The cell phone and computer has made the organizing of large protests much easier and faster in today's political environment. The anger of those that followed the Wallace campaign parroted the anger of the candidate himself. In 2016, this was the case once more as a nation became more divided as the ends of the political spectrum became further polarized. The Kennedys, King, Johnson, Nixon, Humphrey, McCarthy, Vietnam, assassinations, civil rights, riots and hippies would be some of the key words used to describe the 1960s. However, the turbulent decade of the 1960s cannot be discussed without devoting a significant amount of time to the former governor of Alabama and candidate for President of the United States in 1968, George Wallace. In fact, Wallace's career is intertwined with black citizens and their fight for civil rights, crime and the failing inner cities, blue-collar fears of lost jobs and a growing welfare. 47. System. Wallace was a champion in many ways of the blue-collar worker, along with the Southern voter who was in fear of losing control over a segregated society. The fight for states' rights did not end after the American Civil War. 100 years after the nation was torn apart by war, an internal war was developing within the Democratic Party. In the middle of this fight was Governor George Wallace. 50 years after the 1968 presidential election divided the country between three candidates: Richard Nixon the Republican, Hubert Humphrey the Democrat and Wallace the Independent, Donald Trump took a page from the Wallace campaign and rode it to an electoral college win. The similarities between the Wallace campaign of 1968 and Donald Trump's campaign of 2016 are not just based on Wallace's and Trump's confrontational personalities. Both men played on white voters' fears of minority crime, inner-city decay and organized protest movements such as Black Lives Matters. To some voters, these are the worst America has to offer, including being unpatriotic. George Wallace would not admit his segregationist mistake until towards the latter part of his life. Donald Trump does not admit his mistakes. Wallace talked belligerently at people who disagreed with him, not to them. Donald Trump insults those who disagree with him. This statement can be reinforced by the experience of the 15 or so Republican candidates who ran in the Republican primaries against Trump throughout 2015 to 2016. Ask Serge Kovaleski, the reporter with a disease called arthrogryposis that limits the use of joints. Or even Megyn Kelly, formerly of Fox News. Both men used the tactic of intimidation to communicate, not the art of persuasion through cajoling. There are, of course, differences between the two men. George Wallace served in World War II in the U.S. Army Air Force. Later, he served in the Alabama State House and then was elected to 4 consecutive terms as governor of the same state. Donald Trump was never previously elected to a public office. Trump did not serve in the Vietnam War. And it would be fair to say that Wallace was practicing the art of the deal before Trump wrote about it in the late 1980s. In addition, the toughness that Wallace consistently demonstrated came in part from his high school participation in boxing, becoming Golden Glove state champion in Alabama as a bantamweight. Wallace lost very few of his boxing matches. He was a fighter in many aspects of his life. Trump likes winning. He doesn't use his hands to fight, but to negotiate with a pen. 48. However, Trump's art of the deal failed him and his Republican Party in their 7-year campaign to repeal President Obama's Affordable Care Act. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan had to pull the Republican Party's first attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act in March 2017 due to the lack of votes. The second try by House Republicans in May 2017 to repeal the Affordable Care Act succeeded, which they eagerly called the American Health Care Act. The difficult part of the Affordable Care Act repeal and replace died in the Republican-controlled Senate. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell met for weeks in secret with his loyal Senate colleagues to devise the best health care plan that would be politically acceptable. Unfortunately, when the 142-page plan was released and the Congressional Budget Office came out within a week saying the uninsured would go down from 23 million to 22 million, the Better Care Reconciliation Act of 2017 was on life support. In the end, the Republican Party's dream of repeal and replace, to use a medical phrase, flatlined in the U.S. Senate as Republicans voted with Democrats to stop repeal and replace. What would George Wallace have thought of the Senate's health care bill, willing to leave 22 million American citizens without health care coverage? As a governor of Alabama or as a candidate for the presidency, Wallace would have come out vehemently against the Republican Senate bill. Wallace wasn't opposed to federal government spending, it was a matter of whom they were spending the money on. The American Independent Party's 1968 economic platform called for greater government engagement in nearly every other facet of American life, more job training for all Americans willing and able to see and hold gainful employment, more federal monies for transportation, education, and even the space program, a significant increase in Social Security benefits, and more support for elderly health care. 4. The Tale of Two Decades. Before George Wallace ran for the presidency in 1968, he tested the waters in the 1964 Democratic Party primary. The reason for Wallace's impractical run in 1964 was not to beat the popular Democratic President Lyndon Johnson. Wallace knew he couldn't pull that off. Wallace ran in order to send a message to the Democratic Party establishment, Washington, D.C. bureaucrats, and all those in the South that segregation would remain legal. George Wallace became a national figure in part because of the actions of the Kennedy administration the year before. Wallace had famously stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama as governor of Alabama on June 11, 1963 to block the entry of the first black students who had just registered for classes. Wallace became the national representative of a way 49 of life that was at its apex of power. A new generation of Southern Democrats would be on the rise in the South, including Jimmy Carter of Georgia and Reuben Askew of Florida, but for now segregationists still ruled. The conservative ideology of governing with a lean federal government and fewer regulations grew as the years of President Franklin D. Roosevelt became more distant. The nation's growing dependence on the federal government's assistance did not stop under the Democratic administrations of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. Republican President Dwight Eisenhower sustained the New Deal during his 8 years in office, to the ire of conservatives such as Senator Robert Taft and Senator Barry Goldwater. The expansion of Social Security benefits to include the disabled was enacted through the 1956 Social Security Amendments. The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 did not threaten the New Deal, as his support of Medicare picked up political traction before his assassination in November 1963 and would be carried to passage by his successor, former Vice President Lyndon Johnson, in 1965. The growth of the welfare system in the 1950s and 1960s was bipartisan, at least featuring both major parties. The conservative wing of the Republican Party was a small faction from the 1940s to the 1960s, but their ideological crusade was ambitious. Conservative Democrats were more than happy to use federal government money on their home state projects because it was their money, paid in taxes to Washington, D.C. and then refunded. This is what conservatives believed. This is what George Wallace staunchly believed. Wallace also believed in a conservative form of societal separation stamped indelibly in the minds of Southern generations. George Wallace believed in no uncertain terms in the 1960s that black and white children should attend separate schools. But I am a segregationist because I believe that segregation of the races is best for both peoples. I am an Alabama segregationist, though not a Wisconsin segregationist. If Wisconsin believes in integration, that is Wisconsin's business, not mine. And the central government in Washington has no right to tell either Alabama or Wisconsin what to do. 5. The discussion on George Wallace mainly focuses on his home state of Alabama and Southern discrimination and racism towards black people. However, Wallace was not afraid to point out Northern hypocrisy on segregation while speaking on the campaign trail, as he did in 1964 in Wisconsin. 50. Much of the hate and bitterness and ill will in the country today is engendered by government hypocrites who preach one thing and practice another. In the South, we believe in segregation and say so. In other sections of the country, including Milwaukee, where integration is supposed to be in force, Negroes are demonstrating and threatening boycotts because they claim that segregation is still a way of life. I challenge you to visit Chicago, Baltimore, New York, and some other large northern cities and then come to Alabama and see for yourself if there isn't more racial peace than in any city in the North. 6. Wallace had a point. As much as Northern politicians and voters did approve of the oppression of black people, the lives of black people in northern and western cities such as Los Angeles did not reflect a shining city upon a hill either. In 2004, a New York Times article discussed the 1960s riots and their economic consequences for the black population. From 1964 to 1971, there were more than 750 riots, killing 228 people and injuring 12,741 others. After more than 15,000 separate incidents of arson, many black urban neighborhoods were in ruins. The riots not only destroyed many homes and businesses, resulting in about $50 million in property damage in Detroit alone, but far more significantly, they also depressed inner-city incomes and property values for decades. 7. The large cities across the United States, especially those in the Midwest and East, were targets of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and other anti-poverty programs, including the inception of the Model Cities program, implemented by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in 1966 as a corrective to the top-down approach and physical emphasis of urban renewal. Model cities was to focus on comprehensive physical and socio-economic improvements to the country's most impoverished neighborhoods, with meaningful community participation in planning. But after 8 years of experimentation, model cities came to an end, and was quickly written off as a failure, and a footnote. 8 Today's inner-city problems in such cities as Detroit and Chicago are held up by conservatives as prime examples of liberal poverty programs developed in the 1960s still smothering black development and pride. This sentiment was on display during the 2016 presidential campaign as espoused by Donald Trump and has been echoed by conservative writers and politicians since the inception of programs such as Model Cities. 51. Ralph Ryland cited Henry Payne, editorial writer at the Detroit News, who wrote in the monthly magazine The American Spectator. America has suffocated Detroit with compassion, pouring billions of dollars beginning with Lyndon Johnson's Model Cities program in 1966, argues Payne. Trouble is, the liberal medicine turned to poison. Welfare assistance such as aid to families with dependent children ripped apart families, providing perverse incentives for father and mother to stay unmarried. Today, 80% of Detroit children grow up without a father, up from 25% in 1960 before Washington's welfare largesse. 9. Donald Trump promised to make America great again. Although his campaign pledge was not another model city program, any talk of making America great must include redressing the despair in the inner cities. Urban renewal has not been high on the radar of either party since the days of President Jimmy Carter. The 1970s saw 2 major cities, New York and Cleveland, go into economic default. The economic downturn occurred in major cities in the Midwest and Northeast that were governed by the Democratic Party's strong political base. The Republican Party began to tailor its economic message of tax cuts and a smaller federal government to appeal to a new, white suburban base that was scattered throughout the United States. Farmers were still reliable Republican voters going back to the days of Franklin D. Roosevelt. This only left the generational die-hard liberal from the days of FDR as the nucleus of the Democratic Party. The fight for assistance for large cities became a faint liberal cause only championed by supply-side Republicans such as Congressman Jack Kemp, who was pushing the idea of enterprise zones in the early 1980s, which was enacted during the Reagan administration. Although the idea of enterprise zones may be debated by some in academia, many point to its starting point in Great Britain during the 1970s. However, some will say the area of Bedford-Stuyvesant was the first enterprise zone, introduced and made a reality by Senator Robert Kennedy of New York. To combat the problems of the urban poor and blighted areas, Senator Robert Kennedy in 1966 suggested the formation of nonprofit community development corporations which would utilize both the public and private sectors. Kennedy described the problems of urban ghetto areas among the most pressing problems in the United States. Urban violence and rioting, such as had occurred in Watts in 1965, stemmed from deeply rooted social and economic problems, according to Kennedy. Kennedy said, 52. That the problems included poverty, unemployment, welfare dependency, substandard housing, unequal education, and inadequate health care. Government welfare and housing programs ignored the unemployment and social disorganization that caused people to seek public assistance in the first place, Kennedy stated. 10. The idea of a Democrat wanting to use the private sector in coordination with the public sector was not ideologically incompatible. It was not a Democrat or Republican issue. He was a politician wanting to stop the accelerating decay of the inner cities. Even a conservative such as Congressman Jack Kemp, a staunch Republican and future vice presidential candidate on the ticket with Senator Robert Dole in 1996, grasped the problem faced by inner city populations. And where does all this fit into today's politics, one may ask? Politicians in the 21st century have very little interest in working across party lines due to the nature of a new mentality of them versus us. As a nation, we can only look back with admiration at the cooperation and respect displayed by Sam Ervin, a Democrat in the majority, and Howard Baker, a Republican in the minority, working together to investigate a Nixon White House knee-deep in constitutional apathy during the Watergate hearings. Today's political parties circle the wagons more tightly than John Wayne and sprint more quickly than Usain Bolt to protect their party label rather than putting the country first. Wallace's America and Trump's America, despite being 50 years apart, look very similar. The problems facing politicians such as Wallace, Johnson, Robert Kennedy, and Hubert Humphrey in the 1960s have been carried into the 21st century. The inner cities were hit with another crisis in the first decade of the century, this time having to do with housing. Gimme shelter. The worst economic depression since the Great Depression of the 1930s left millions underwater financially, forcing many to give up on parts of the American dream. Foreclosures were affecting not only the inner cities, but this time the suburbs as well. The one difference between the two was that a foreclosed home in the suburbs might stay empty for a few months, but would be bought at a cheaper price by a middle-class family, while those in the inner cities, such as in Cleveland, Ohio, were abandoned to blight. The 53. American dream for these families was demolished with a wrecking ball and bulldozers. Where did these families go? All these foreclosures were now the problem of the city of Cleveland and of other cities. The states would also become involved in assisting these cities, whether they wanted to or not, with the assistance of the federal government under the Obama administration. An article in USA Today by Jack Garvin in 2013 describes the impact the 2008 economic crisis was continuing to have on real estate and homeownership. For years, housing served as the backbone of economic growth and as an investment opportunity that propelled generations of Americans into the middle class. But the financial crisis burst the housing bubble and devastated the real estate market, leaving millions facing foreclosure, millions more underwater, and generally stripping Americans of years' worth of accumulated wealth. 11. The housing crisis was still not over in early 2016. Jim Rokakis, Vice President with the Cleveland-based Western Reserve Land Conservancy and Director of the Thriving Communities Institute, explained the problem facing cities such as Cleveland. If you don't help us with $20,000 to tear down 2 derelict houses on a street, you will see people walk away from $200,000 mortgages on that same street. 12. In the same article, the extent of the housing crisis is revealed. In some Cleveland neighborhoods, 1 in 5 homes are abandoned compared to 1 in 10 across the whole city. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, there are 2.5 million vacant homes in the hardest-hit 25 American cities. 13. Although there is always fear and criticism among those who self-identify as conservatives of federal government interference in the free market, the federal government did intervene in the housing crisis during the Obama administration. The Home Affordable Modification Program was started in 2012 and was administered by the U.S. Department of the Treasury with the goal to offer homeowners who are at risk of foreclosure reduced monthly mortgage payments that are affordable and sustainable over the long term. HAMP works by encouraging participating mortgage servicers to modify mortgages so struggling homeowners can have lower monthly payments and 54. Avoid foreclosure. It has specific eligibility requirements for homeowners and includes strict guidelines for servicers. The program includes incentives for homeowners, servicers, and investors to encourage successful mortgage modifications. 14. HAMP was not as large as some of the more ambitious programs of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, but it demonstrates once again that when financial crisis hits large cities or states, many people look to the federal government for a helping hand. The economic crisis that began in the latter part of George W. Bush's presidency propelled a Democratic administration to step up to deal with the collapse of the housing market. The federal government was watching over society again in response to the greed of those in the private sector who were trying to make a buck off unqualified homebuyers. So here we are, America. 50 years after politicians first tried to solve an array of social problems in the inner city, the politicians of 2017 are governing in a country where people are trapped in numerous violent enclaves, including Chicago and Los Angeles. The debate over the outcome of the Great Society programs is still fervent and ongoing within academia, and it won't end with this book. We do know that one problem contributing to the violence in the inner cities is that too many black children are growing up without a parent. One of the last estimates in 2013, which was verified by PolitiFact, had 72% of African American children born out of wedlock and 67% of African American children raised by one parent. 15. Hang on African Americans, help is on the way. How will Donald Trump approach the problems of inner-city crime, unemployment, and the lack of parental oversight? During the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump was not shy about addressing the problems African Americans faced in the inner cities. In fact, he promised to make life better for African Americans in general. "We're going to work on our ghettos," he said during a rally in Toledo. "You take a look at what's going on, where you have pockets of areas of land where you have the inner cities and you have so many things, so many problems. So many horrible, horrible problems. The violence. The death. The lack of education. No jobs. We're gonna work with the African 55 American community and we're going to solve the problem of the inner city," he pledged. 16. After the dust settled and the election results had been analyzed, how did it turn out that Trump did with the African American voter? In blunt terms, African Americans were not impressed with Trump's proposed New America. Trump earned only a paltry 8% of the African American vote, but 58% of the white vote. Overall, Hillary Clinton earned 94% of the female black vote and 80% of the male black vote. This reflects larger trends nationally, with Clinton earning 54% of women's votes and just 41% of men's, and is also significantly higher than the number of Hispanic votes, of which Clinton won 62% of Latino men and 68% of Latina women. 17. Hillary Clinton did not receive the incredible number of votes President Obama secured in 2008 and 2012 from both African American and Latino voters. This wasn't shocking or unexpected. However, if the Great Society did not help African Americans out of their plight, why is it that the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, can no longer appeal to African American voters? A conservative would ask why African Americans should keep voting for Democrats who espouse an outdated liberal ideology that sustains these same people in a cycle of decay and poverty. Can Americans keep blaming the political party that tried to use the federal government as a tool for assistance in the 1960s, or is it time to look at the policies of the Republican Party as well? Or maybe the Republican Party decided it was not worth the potential loss of a reliable white base to presumably help a large number of black Americans living in the inner cities that white Americans seem to have abandoned over 50 years ago. On January 30, 2018, President Trump entered the chamber of the United States House of Representatives feeling good about the success of the United States economy. To underscore this continuing success from the previous administration, President Trump touted the record low unemployment rate of African Americans and Hispanic Americans. While this was a true statement and Republicans stood with enthusiastic cheers, the unemployment rate for African Americans has been on the decline since 2010 to 2011. However, days after the president spoke to the nation about these great numbers, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that African American unemployment did rise again significantly, from 6.8% to 7.7%, from December 2017 to January 2018. 18. 56. As Americans, we should hope and strive for low employment for all groups. Key to addressing the fact that certain groups have disproportionately high unemployment rates is understanding why this continues to happen. After the first term of a Trump presidency, it will be an achievement if the Bureau of Labor Statistics announces a low unemployment percentage for African Americans, say 6%. In addition, it will be an achievement to see, along with a decreased unemployment rate, a decrease in crime in the inner cities, a decrease in out-of-wedlock births for African Americans and renewed respect between police and the African American community. In order to address the reprehensible violence overtaking parts of Chicago, one of President Trump's solutions was to send in the feds. If federal government programs had not quelled the violence and poverty among African Americans that was in part leading to crime, then a show of federal government muscle would do the trick. Kelly Cohen of the Washington Examiner wrote that there is a precedent for the federal government entering a partnership deal with local law enforcement to reduce gun violence. A recent example was seen last year, in Indianapolis, which saw more than 145 criminal homicides in 2016. 19 along with cities such as Indianapolis. Cohen points out that Rahm Emanuel, the Democratic mayor of Chicago, welcomed Trump's offer. Send more FBI, DEA, ATF agents, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel said during a news conference this week. We don't have to talk about it anymore. Just send them. 20 The violence that has gripped Chicago in recent years is getting national attention. Unfortunately, the relationship between law enforcement, black citizens, and elected officials is characterized by contempt, misunderstanding and distrust. The Black Lives Matter movement is not a group that President Trump and his staff will be anxious to meet with anytime soon. A meeting with such a group would not go over well with his base. This is not to say rural America or its voters do not care about inner-city crime. However, it is a problem that most of these voters cannot understand, having been raised with a polar opposite way of life. No voter wants to see crime elevated anywhere in America. The idea of crime rising across America was an important part of Donald Trump's campaign speeches. The fact that violent crime was still at a 30-year low, as reported in the FBI's national crime figures for 2015, didn't seem to matter to the American people, as 7 in 10 said crime was rising and concern about crime rose to a 15-year high. 21. 57. Fear is in all of us as human beings. Some people are better than others at hiding their fear. There is always the fear of the unknown. Most of the more than 320 million Americans are unknown to each other, as different races and cultures don't always interact. Many Americans stay in areas that feel safe and exclusive. This is also a natural feeling. People covet security. Politicians have been using fear to get elected for a long time across many diverse countries. Fear can be a motivator for good and bad. The comparison between supporters of George Wallace and those of Donald Trump was well documented in articles throughout Trump's primary campaign. As Trump was on the verge of securing the Republican nomination, Peter Bionart of The Atlantic wrote, Trump's supporters exhibit high levels of what political scientists call authoritarianism. Authoritarians are unusually fearful of disorder and favor simple, brutal methods of quashing it. As Amanda Taub has noted, when many Americans perceived imminent physical threats, the population of authoritarians could seem to swell rapidly. So by fanning popular fears of chaos, especially violent chaos, Trump wins yet more votes. 22 And yes, on November 8, 2016 Donald Trump secured the presidency by reaching 270 in the Electoral College. The campaign of George Wallace in 1968 and his subsequent third-place finish behind Hubert Humphrey and the narrow vote winner Richard Nixon did not put an end to his belief in an alternative America. Wallace ran again for the Democratic nomination in 1972, hoping to pick up where he left off in 1968. The sight of George Wallace at the 1972 Democratic Convention being lifted onto the stage in his wheelchair, paralyzed by an attempted assassin's bullet, was an eerie end to his presidential ambitions. Wallace's 9-minute speech to a semi-enthused delegation comprised a litany of promises he had made during the primaries. Wallace was not done being a member of the Democratic Party as he spoke to a new generation of Democrats. I am here because I want to help the Democratic Party, Mr. Wallace told a courteous but restrained throng of delegates and spectators. I want to help it become what it used to be, the party of the average working man. 23 The Wallace voters would coalesce around Governor of Georgia Jimmy Carter in 1976 after Wallace's fourth presidential bid failed. However, After the 4-year Carter presidency ended with a stagnant economy and a perception of weakness on the stage of foreign affairs, Wallace voters saw 58. Republican presidential nominee Ronald Reagan in 1980 as the new champion of the average working man. The blue-collar workers whom Wallace was targeting in 1968 and 1972 are of the same economic class Trump won in 2016. Wallace could not reverse the Democratic Party's departure from its long-entrenched Southern institutions. It is yet to be known if the voters Trump attracted in 2016 are a new breed of Republican voters who see the Democratic Party as the party of the minority. Or were these voters just a temporary large bloc whose disdain for Democratic Party nominee Hillary Clinton was enough to tilt normally blue states such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin to the Republican column? The 2018 midterm elections will be the first test of this unorthodox Trump coalition. The significance of George Wallace to the Democratic Party cannot be overstated. Wallace represented not only the original Democratic Party, but a way of life that was no longer being tolerated by the new left of the Democratic Party. George McGovern was the new face of the Democratic Party, too far left for most Americans and even some Democrats. But the Democratic Party was no longer just the party of the coalition forged by Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Vietnam War and the civil rights movement of the 1960s began to wipe that coalition out, and George Wallace was one of the last remnants of it. Donald Trump is a member of the Republican Party, but he is not a conventional Republican, as the media and members of the Republican establishment have repeatedly found out. Trump's rhetoric throughout the primary season and the general election was as direct and controversial as any speeches George Wallace made in his 4 attempts at the presidency. Those who oppose Trump say that his supporters have embraced a person steeped in bombastic vocabulary and apathy about the truth. And those who support Trump say he is the truthful voice that the establishment Republicans have been afraid to be for much too long. George Wallace was an extension of the Democratic Party, but he never became the national face of the Democratic Party, in large part due to the Democratic primary voters. Donald Trump won the presidency and is now the face of the National Republican Party. The anger of this movement was taken out on President Obama. Democracy in the United States became divisive and politically dysfunctional during and after the controversial presidential election in 2000 when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of George W. Bush over Vice President Al Gore. The lack of understanding or even acknowledgement that half of the nation's voters were angry about the Supreme Court's decision did not faze the new Bush administration. The Bush team came in with an attitude of don't look back and don't acknowledge problems with the voting process, as this would only intimate weakness. Leading this egotistical charge was Vice President Dick Cheney. 8 years later, Bush's presidency was viewed with disdain and disappointment not only by liberals, but by many conservatives who felt Bush sold out the conservative movement. The aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terror attacks gave President Bush an historic opportunity to heal the nation's pain and unite it around fighting the terrorists who had attacked the country. Bush did just that and the country responded with pride temporarily. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, pushed by the neoconservatives in and out of the Bush administration, became the permanent dividing point politically between Democrats and Republicans. The 2004 presidential contest between President George W. Bush and the Democratic nominee, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, was focused on 2 areas: fighting terrorism and the invasion of Iraq. Bush would narrowly win re-election over Kerry. In fact, this was the closest re-election win by a sitting president since Woodrow Wilson in 1916 during World War I. The closeness of Bush's win did not deter Vice President Cheney from saying that Bush had run on a clear agenda and that the nation resounded by giving him a mandate. The idea that President Bush and his policies now had a mandate due to his re-election was also reiterated by numerous conservative and Republican loyalists. 77. William J. Bennett, conservative author and nationally syndicated radio host, having restored decency to the White House, President Bush now has a mandate to effect policy that will promote a more decent society, through both politics and law. His supporters want that, and have given him a mandate in their popular and electoral votes to see to it. To William Crystal, Weekly Standard executive editor, the hair pullers and teeth gnashers won't like it, of course, but we're nevertheless inclined to call this a mandate. Indeed, in one sense, we think it an even larger and clearer mandate than those won in the landslide re-election campaigns of Nixon in 1972, Reagan in 1984, and Clinton in 1996. 3. And finally, Tucker Carlson of Fox News, Abadi has done it since 1988. The president wins re-election with a majority of the vote. It is a mandate. What will he do with it now? 4. The significance of saying that a president's re-election automatically means he has a mandate for his policies can come back to haunt ideologically rigid writers such as those just cited. We will visit this point again later in this chapter. However, let us go back to the aftermath of the second George W. Bush term ending in January 2009. Enter Senator Barack Obama of Illinois. Obama's meteoric rise has been documented in many books, articles, and documentaries. His life story, from a childhood without a father, to being raised by a single mother along with strong grandparents, is truly worth reading in Dreams from My Father. Unlike many politicians who write books just before declaring their intention to run for president, Obama wrote this book in 1995, long before he or the nation knew of his potential. When Obama spoke at the 2004 Democratic Convention, he was a senator from Illinois. However, his words about an America that was not red versus blue or liberal versus conservative but a United States of America resonated with many watching that night who saw a country that was rapidly splintering politically. Barack Obama sensed that the political movement in the United States was moving away from a middle-right thought to a more progressive pragmatism. In February 2007, Obama followed his gut feelings and political instinct and entered the Democratic primary field. Hillary Clinton and the rest of the Democratic field would find out that Obama was not the wet behind the ears amateur politician they expected. 78. Barack Obama fought a vicious primary battle with Hillary Clinton that brought out the worst in both Hillary and Bill Clinton. Obama's entry into the Democratic field in 2007 did not scare the Clintons. In fact, Hillary Clinton was probably more worried about the Southern charm and likability factor of the 2004 Democratic vice presidential nominee, John Edwards. However, Obama's campaign team took a page from the incredible grassroots army put together by George McGovern some 35 years earlier in his march to the Democratic nomination. Barack Obama won the Democratic nomination and then went on to defeat the Republican nominee, Senator John McCain of Arizona, by a 53% to 46% margin while gathering 365 electoral votes. The start of something evil. The election of Barack Obama as the 44th President of the United States was an historic moment for the United States. In time, Obama's election will be celebrated as a turning point in American political history regardless of whether one was passionately for him or ardently opposed. But initially, the reality of a President Barack Obama created fissures within the American psyche that continued into 2017. The campaign slogan of Barack Obama in 2008 was Simple Hope. The opposition to this hope started rather quickly and the animosity towards President Obama's election was swift. Republican Party members along with the right-wing media hoped the Obama presidency would fail from the beginning. The most frequently quoted wish for failure was Rush Limbaugh's comment to Sean Hannity on January 21, 2009. Although Barack Obama had been President of the United States for only one day, this didn't dull Limbaugh's skepticism about an Obama presidency. And did anyone from the political left really expect Limbaugh to say anything other than the following? If he gets nationalized health care, I mean, it's over, Sean. We're never going to roll that back. That's the end of America as we have known it because that's then going to set the stage for everything being government-owned, operated, or provided. Why would I want that to succeed? I don't believe in that. I know that's not how this country is going to be great in the future, it's not what made this country great. So I shamelessly say, no, I want him to fail. If his agenda is a far-left collectivism, some people say socialism, as a conservative heartfelt, deeply, Why would I want socialism to succeed? 5. 79. Then Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana chimed in 2 months into the Obama presidency, saying that the Republican Party should not be browbeaten into having to say they would support President Obama and the Democrat Party agenda. Jindal noted, of all the talk about Obama failing, my answer to the question is very simple: do you want the president to fail? It depends on what he is trying to do. 6. By 2010, the attitude of Republicans in the House and Senate had not improved much, especially after they had won control of the House of Representatives. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell was finally honest in his assessment of the chances of getting the Republican agenda passed. The only way Republicans in Congress can achieve their goals is to put someone in the White House who won't veto a repeal of Obama's health care reform, spending cuts, and shrinking the government. 7. The list of Republican Party members and right-wing media pundits who can be quoted saying that they hope he fails and he will be a one-term president goes on and on. President Trump enforces the belief of many on the political right that President Obama was protected by the liberal media, and that this same liberal media is going after Trump with its conspiratorial fake news. For many voters in America, the land of the free, it doesn't matter what the media says unless it comes from a source they believe is trustworthy. The list of accusations against President Obama from his first month in office all the way through to 2016 are too numerous to list here. However, a good place to start is an article by Matt Gertz called "How Years of the Right-Wing Media's Obama Hatred Paved the Way for Trump," written on President Obama's last day in office. 8. The rise of the Tea Party in 2009 and the seething anger of the Republican right wing during the Obama years is not an unprecedented phenomenon in American political history. Many anti-federalists were not fans of the bank plan devised by the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, during George Washington's first term as president. Political infighting began to take on a life of its own as factions led by Thomas Jefferson, Washington's Secretary of State, and Hamilton fought for dominance. John Adams, as the second President of the United States, had his vocal and numerous political enemies. Almost 25 years later, John 80. Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, would be the focal point of Andrew Jackson's political anger as the two-party system began to change American politics by 1828. Jackson was not hoping success would be the legacy of the sixth President of the United States. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 pushed Southern politicians over the edge as secession became their answer to Washington, D.C. and the newly elected administration. Abraham Lincoln was more than aware of Southerners' feelings towards him. As many biographies of Lincoln attest, he faced an immeasurable amount of political pressure. Lincoln was hated by people from a variety of political ideologies and party affiliations at the time of his first term, but his belief in a united country was stronger than his detractors' hate. The 8 years of George W. Bush's administration are gradually becoming distant enough for presidential historians to better assess his place among those who have occupied the Oval Office. As has been the tradition since the days of historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Sr., who first did a presidential poll of historians in 1948 and then again in 1962, the ranking of a U.S. president is heavily determined by the performance of his predecessor. By 2008, Americans were ready for a change, not only of certain policies, but in the dynamics of the person communicating the message. Barack Obama seemed to be the right person at the right time to fill this void. When U.S. Senator Barack Obama first announced he was a candidate for the Democratic Party nomination on February 10, 2007 in Chicago, Illinois, there were many who felt Obama was not ready to become President of the United States yet. Senators Hillary Clinton and John Edwards, along with longtime Senator from Delaware Joe Biden, were seen as the heavyweights in the race. However, less than a year later, this upstart junior senator from Illinois pulled off a well-organized and seismic victory in the Iowa caucuses, setting in motion a type of political grassroots movement not seen since the days of George McGovern in 1972. Obama's insight and savvy propelled him to victory over Republican nominee John McCain on November 4, 2008. Barack Obama was not done. Perhaps he had read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book Team of Rivals. Reminiscent of Abraham Lincoln choosing his rivals for the Republican nomination in 1860 as members of his cabinet, as the president-elect, Obama had Joe Biden as his vice president, Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State and one-time announced candidate Tom Vilsack as Secretary of Agriculture. 81. In early April 2017, Donald Trump declared that he had inherited a mess from President Obama. If Trump inherited a mess, Barack Obama inherited a cataclysmic depression from President George W. Bush. The collapse of Wall Street that dominated the campaign in the fall of 2008 had its warning signs in 2006 with the housing market. On November 17, 2006, the Commerce Department had warned that October's new home permits were 28% lower than the year before. But government officials didn't think the housing slowdown would affect the rest of the economy. In fact, they were relieved that the overheated real estate market appeared to be returning to normal. But as home prices fell, they triggered subprime mortgage defaults. By August 2007, the Federal Reserve recognized that banks didn't have enough liquidity to function. The Fed began adding liquidity by buying bank subprime mortgages. 9. The financial crisis only deepened by March 2008. The Federal Reserve intervened to save the failing investment bank Bear Stearns, the first casualty of the subprime mortgage crisis. In July 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis spread to government-sponsored agencies Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They required a government bailout. The Treasury Department guaranteed $25 billion of their loans and bought shares of Fannie's and Freddie's stock. Lehman Brothers then declared bankruptcy in September, followed by the Fed bailing out insurance company AIG. Congress finally passed the bailout bill in early October that was first introduced by Secretary of the Treasury Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, on September 20. However, it was too late as the economy was sinking. The Labor Department reported that the economy had lost a whopping 159,000 jobs in the prior month. On Monday, October 6, the Dow dropped 800 points, closing below 10,000 for the first time since 2004. 10. How candidates Barack Obama and John McCain approached the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression defined the election for many voters. McCain, one of the Senate's most senior members, wanted to suspend his campaign and fly back to Washington, D.C. to address the financial crisis. Obama gathered himself in his calculable, calm manner, telling the American people that a quality the President of the United States must possess is the ability to handle multiple crises. The American 82. Economy could not be told to suspend itself while decisions were being debated. Although candidate John McCain felt his approach to the financial crisis was merited, many witnessed the seasoned politician trying to deal with a new, serious crisis with old solutions. Enter President Obama and his political calculation on the healthcare debate. A big foo %, #**** deal. The idea of governing when a party has a majority sounds simple in a democracy. The political history of the United States is full of examples demonstrating the effectiveness of majority rule. The 20th century is a political scientist's dream. Legislative action filled the chambers during the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Calvin Coolidge, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton. However, none of these men and their respective Congresses could get health care reform passed. President Bill Clinton's well-known struggle to reform the health care system witnessed one of the livelier debates on the issue since President Truman's proclamation that he wanted national health care for all Americans. And, of course, First Lady Hillary Clinton's involvement in trying to lead President Clinton's health initiative in 1993 to 1994 failed. However, it did render her a favorite target for right-wing hatred that would last into the 2016 presidential election. President Obama's presidency hit the ground running when the House of Representatives under Democratic control passed the president's stimulus recovery program within 10 days of taking office. Less than 3 weeks later, the Democratic-controlled Senate passed the final measure with a vote of 60 to 38 with the help of 3 moderate Republicans. The stimulus package was $787 billion, with 2/3 spending and net THIRD tax cuts. No Republican voted for the measure in the House. So began the Obama presidency. The idea that President Obama began his presidency by not including the minority Republican Party members in the development of the stimulus bill would be a talking point for years to come. Going back in time, the Chicago Tribune reported on January 27, 2009, before the stimulus bill was voted on, that Obama has been working the Republican side of the aisle for weeks. He has made phone calls not just to GOP leaders but also to rank-and-file members. 1183. In order to get some Republicans on board, President Obama included tax breaks for small businesses, as was happily reiterated by Obama's White House press secretary Robert Gibbs. There are already provisions in this bill relating to net operating loss, tax cuts, and other small business tax cuts that are directly related to suggestions that Republicans have given the economic team, the President of the United States and other members of Congress. 12. The 40% of the stimulus bill dedicated to tax cuts was not enough to convince even one Republican in the House to vote for the measure. John Avallone, a speechwriter for former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, wrote of President Obama's sincere desire to reach out to Republicans in an effort to make good on his campaign pledge to bring more bipartisanship to Washington, D.C. Republicans must know that they have got to be something more than the party of no. Democrats should resist the temptation to pass the stimulus bill along party lines alone. It's significant that President Obama wants a broader victory to signify a break with the 51% means a mandate, play to the base politics of the past. He understands that's the change voters are looking for. And facing a potentially combustible combination of high expectations and a down economy, he knows the old adage that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. 13. Nothing explains the Obama presidency and the opposition from the Republican right better than the fight to pass the infamous Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act that was discussed, debated, and passed in 2010. Perhaps no one judged the consequences of the health care bill better than Vice President Joe Biden when he whispered loudly to President Obama at the signing ceremony, "This is a big fucking deal." Many economists and political analysts will declare that a president's economic or legislative accomplishment may take years to fully develop. The response of the American people who may benefit the most from a specific piece of legislation that passes both branches of the House and is signed by the president can be negative at the outset. Change can be difficult for many to accept. The attempt to change the way Americans receive health care and their benefits has proven to be the most difficult political issue any president of the United States has faced in the past. 84. 75 years. After passing the Affordable Care Act, President Obama and the Democratic Party in the House and Senate found out why. Washington, D.C. can be a lonely place when politicians actually do their job. If people need a reminder, just ask the Democratic members of the House of Representatives who voted to pass the federal assault weapons ban for President Clinton in September 1994. Some of the members who voted yes would end up being among the 54 House Democratic members who lost their seats along with 8 Democratic senators 2 months later. With these enormous losses, the political foundation of Washington, D.C. experienced a seismic shock. The historical significance of the Republican landslide in November 1994 cannot be ignored. For the first time in 42 years the Republican Party controlled the House of Representatives. History does repeat itself. However, this time a president of the United States was actually able to push through health care reform with a majority in both houses. Remember, part of the legacy of any president is what legislation he can or cannot get passed while in the Oval Office. The period of the first 100 days of a presidency is important for one reason: it is a brief slice of a president's term when cooperation is still a legitimate option in the opposition party's encyclopedia of political maneuvering. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is now known to most Americans as Obamacare. The reader can decide how to assess President Obama's accomplishment, but whether positive or negative, his name is attached to a very significant piece of legislation because it was passed. Barack Obama was elected in 2008 by a comfortable margin on the idea of change. One change that he enacted was to the healthcare system. Unfortunately, a funny thing happened on the way to passing the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. It became a political rallying cry for the Republican right wing led by none other than Sarah Palin. The lead up to the vote on the health care bill even brought another first from the Republican right. When addressing a joint session of Congress on September 9, 2009, Congressman Joe Wilson of South Carolina yelled out "You lie" at President Obama when the president said his health care bill would not insure illegal immigrants. In today's real news media bubble, the consumers of media technology feel they have the right to pass around information that fits their own personal agenda. Journalism as the country knew it under legends such as 85. W.E.B. Du Bois, H.L. Mencken, Ida B. Wells, Lincoln Steffens, Walter Lippmann, Edward R. Murrow, Theodore White, Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, William F. Buckley, William Safire, Carl Rowan, Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, Jane Meyer and Gloria Steinem are fading. The problem is not that there is no talent in the field of journalism today. The United States is becoming a country where targeted information is being passed off as daily news. No longer do men and women sit around the kitchen table reading the morning and afternoon news. The news is written by amateur bloggers, angry citizens developing their own websites or going on Facebook to initiate or continue to spread malicious stories passed off as the truth. The importance of the initial discussions on the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is obvious. Those who did not want President Obama and the Democrats to pass any health care reform did their best to begin a coordinated effort to sabotage the bill before it was even brought up for a vote. We heard the voice of Congressman Joe Wilson shouting out his thoughts and pushing his constituents further away from the truth. PolitiFact posted a section-by-section rebuttable of an email chain that was going around the internet in the summer of 2009. On July 30, 2009, Angie Drobnik-Holland wrote, "Most of what the email says is wrong. In fact, it's a clearinghouse of bad information circulating around the web about proposed healthcare changes, so we thought it would be helpful to address a bunch of its claims. To check this email, we read the healthcare bill ourselves. Yes, it's over 1,000 pages long, but that's not as long as you might think. The document has large margins, so the text only takes up about 1/3 of each page. We also read the bill's legislative summary, a report published by the House that explains the bill in greater detail. Finally, we consulted with Jennifer Tolbert, an independent healthcare analyst at the Kaiser Family Foundation, a nonpartisan foundation that studies healthcare reform. Tolbert has read and analyzed all the major health proposals, including those of the Republicans, and the foundation provides point-by-point analyses of the plans on its website. 14. One of the leading critics of the Affordable Care Act and the voice of policy analysis for the Republican Party was Sarah Palin. Palin's most infamous statement in August 2009, in the midst of the health care debate, was that the Obama health care plan would create death panels that 86 senior citizens on Medicare would be required to sit in front of to discuss their end-of-life options. The start of Palin's death panel lie is actually a bad game of fourth-grade telephone. Betsy McCaughey, a former lieutenant governor of New York and a constitutional scholar with a Ph.D. from Columbia University, had been the source of misconceptions and lies during the health care debate during President Clinton's first 2 years in office in 1993 to 1994, and she now set out to target Obama's plan. 15. McCaughey had started the death panel myth, and conservative politicians such as Sarah Palin and other like-minded conservatives in the media proceeded to spread the bad news that a panel of bureaucrats would decide the fate of elderly Americans. Doug Porter of the San Diego Free Press reiterated in 2013 what PolitiFact determined in 2009. Palin's first deployment of death panel in August 2009 was in reference to the advanced care planning provision of the House health care bill, and she said it would decide whether senior citizens and the disabled were worthy of health care. This was a lie, and Palin got called out on it, earning herself PolitiFact's Lie of the Year award. 16. A political party rallying around an issue is nothing new in American democracy. Perhaps the first issue on which a faction found its voice as an organized group was opposition to the Jay Treaty negotiated by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Jay with Great Britain in 1794. The pro-French Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, faced off against the pro-Britain Federalist Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and President George Washington. The Jay Treaty was vilified by the pro-Republican press, a prelude to today's cable news network wars. The list of politically divisive issues was expanded over the next 200 years to include the National Bank, the annexation of Texas, slavery, corporate monopolies, civil rights, taxes, war, abortion, gun control, and the size of the federal government. Healthcare reform can now be added to this list. Where does repeal/replace of the Affordable Care Act as touted by Donald Trump and his supporters fit into the discussion of the Know-Nothing Party in 1840s and 1850s? In terms of the health care issue itself, it doesn't. However, the tradition of a core group rallying around one issue does fit. The Know-Nothing movement was built on the premise 87. That the American heritage founded on the ideals of the American Revolution would be vulnerable to a wave of foreigners. The Know-Nothing Party was the only one able to stop it. The Affordable Care Act was promoted and passed by a president and his majority party that were bent on turning the American health care system into socialized medicine. The Republican Party, now led by the insurgent Republican Donald Trump, was the only one able to stop it. Outrage over the Affordable Care Act also contributed in part to the Tea Party movement, whose members no longer supported establishment Republicans such as John Boehner. Out-of-control spending and a health care plan based on supporting those who could not afford coverage was enough for Tea Party members to take aim at not only President Obama, but certain Republican members who were not far enough to the political right. To top all this off for the Tea Party movement, Boehner had the audacity as Speaker of the House to negotiate a deal with President Obama to reduce the national debt in 2011, only to fold under pressure from within his own party. Boehner's grand deal fell apart because President Obama moved the agreement to a place that conservative Republican members could not accept. Opposition to the Affordable Care Act was swift and coordinated by the Republican Party and its conservative media allies. President Obama enjoyed a majority in the House and Senate, and he was willing to use his political capital sooner rather than later. Many on the political right would accuse President Obama and the Democrats of ramming through the health care bill. This type of accusation is not new from either side, political left or right. However awful one side may consider a bill that the majority maneuvers through the legislative process, the men and women voting on these bills were elected democratically by the people. As this chapter was being written, the House Republicans rammed through their own version of health care reform, the partial repeal of the Affordable Care Act, called the American Health Care Act. The vote was 217 to 213, with no Democrats voting yes. Some of the Republican congressmen that voted for the repeal admitted they had not even read what was in the bill, a point about which the now Speaker of the House had scolded Democrats in the summer of 2009. Rep. Chris Collins of New York told CNN's Wolf Blitzer on Thursday that he did not read the entire bill. "I will fully admit, Wolf, I did not," Collins said. "But I can also assure you my staff did. We have to rely on our staff." 88. Collins also had to ask a reporter from the Buffalo News to explain to him a provision of the AHCA that would cut $3 billion in funding to help low and middle-income New Yorkers pay for health care. Rep. Mark Sanford of South Carolina, who flipped his vote to a yes on the AHCA days before its passage, told CNN that he looked at the bill but did not absorb all of it. "I turned through every page," Sanford said. "As to whether or not I got through some of the details in some of the pages, no. But yes, I attempted to read the entire bill." 17. The Republican House version of the health care bill did not pass the Senate as 3 Republicans, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and John McCain, voted no in July 2017. The only part of the Affordable Care Act that was successfully repealed was the individual mandate. President Trump triumphantly claimed that the Affordable Care Act had been repealed and replaced. Well, not quite. Either way, the controversy over this bill has put the House of Representatives majority in play for the Democrats in 2018. The old adage of what comes around goes around came back like a boomerang to hit the Republican political right in the head. The political left has not been this organized and focused since the 2008 Obama campaign, and may in fact better resemble the opposition to the Vietnam War. Healthcare has been a rallying point like no other issue over the past 7 years for both political parties, and the outcome will affect all Americans in some way. Former Vice President Joe Biden may talk out of turn or say too much, but he was spot on when he told President Obama that the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was a big fucking deal. Not in my schoolhouse. With a resounding 46% of the people behind him, President Trump was ready on January 20, 2017 to undo the carnage that the Obama administration had wrought upon the American people. The Affordable Care Act has already been discussed as the biggest prize that Trump and the Republican Party want to hang on the wall of Obama conquests like a political safari hunt. However, as Trump and the Republicans act to repeal the Affordable Care Act, others in the Trump administration are dramatically changing the next largest American institution that affects over 50 million children: education. 1889. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, a very strong advocate of charter and private schools as an alternative to the public school system, is already showing her determination to provide public tax dollars to a minority of people to attend the school of their choice. Now, there are many loaded hypocrisies just in that first sentence. If this were a Democrat administration wanting to take from the rich and give to the poor? Or what about the idea of being able to make one's own choice? Isn't that what the left would want, with a woman's right to choose to end a pregnancy? DeVos released her budget on the priorities of her Department of Education in May 2017, and let's just say it was not too kind to the future of public education. Those who choose to send their children to private or charter schools were seeing a new friend in DeVos. The cuts DeVos would make to college work-study programs and public service loan forgiveness programs, along with money for mental health needs in public schools, would go to school choice, as reported by the Washington Post. The administration would channel part of the savings into its top priority, school choice. It seeks to spend about $400 million to expand charter schools and vouchers for private and religious schools, and another $1 billion to push public schools to adopt choice-friendly policies. The cuts would make space for investments in choice, including $500 million for charter schools, up 50% over current funding. The administration also wants to spend $250 million on education innovation and research grants, which would pay for expanding and studying the impacts of vouchers for private and religious schools. It's not clear how much would be spent on research versus on the vouchers themselves. 19. The argument put forth by DeVos and other Republicans is that the public schools are failing Americans, and therefore choosing to leave the failed system is a child's only option. President Obama, along with his Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, were just another administration involved in the perpetual, monumental failure that surrounds the public school system. As approximately 89% of children attend public schools, the idea that a small minority will be chosen to leave the inner-city schools of Chicago, Cleveland, and Los Angeles for the comfort of a charter school is not a public education solution, but a distribution of tax dollars to private education. No one will deny that the public school systems across America have problems. The challenge of teaching children from one-parent homes in 90 areas rife with poverty and crime can be daunting. However, reality comes from the fact that there are teachers that must go to these depressed areas every day and try to teach economically and socially disadvantaged children. These are areas in a county that most suburban parents don't see on a daily basis nor can relate to as parents. Some people in positions of power, such as Betsy DeVos, claim that the public school system doesn't work for 50 million children and therefore a new approach is needed. In addition, they single out the teachers' unions as the problem. But the public school systems are facing expanding enrollment numbers while dealing with crumbling schools built in the period spanning the administrations of Warren G. Harding and John F. Kennedy. At times, it seems as if taxpayers are more willing to build a new sports stadiums in a quicker time span than a new school for children. Encouraging private school enrollment and charter schools may sound like an alternative to the plight of inner-city public schools, but what happens when the private schools become overwhelmed with poor kids wanting to get their white, suburban education? What happens when poor inner-city minorities want to attend private religious schools funded by a large majority of white suburban families? Guess what? The schools will become overcrowded and more expensive. Will these same individuals who don't want to vote for public school levies because their children attend private schools be willing to increase their yearly enrollment fees? Betsy DeVos' crusade to fund private religious schools in addition to charter schools needs to be discussed because of the collision course this will present to taxpayers and their money. Unless there is a directive from President Trump to DeVos that no taxpayer dollars can go to religious affiliations, such as for Muslim schools or perhaps even something on the fringe such as Scientology, many of Trump's 2016 supporters will find it difficult to stomach, to say the least. The Know Nothing Party supported public schools being run with a Protestant bias and the teaching of the King James Bible in disregard of Catholic beliefs. Are we heading this way again in the 21st century with Muslim schools as the new target? We have already seen, even prior to the rise of Donald Trump, states trying to insert language into their education funding programs to divert taxpayer dollars from public schools to private and charter schools. Louisiana in 2012 passed a law very similar to the scenario described above. However, after Louisiana legislators learned that various religious schools could apply for state government money in the very bill they passed, outrage replaced their enthusiasm. 91. Stakes escalated last week when, to the frustration of some lawmakers, the Islamic School of Greater New Orleans applied for federal funds under the voucher program. Republican State Rep. Kenneth Havard objected to the Islamic school's request for 38 government-paid student vouchers, saying he opposed any bill that will fund Islamic teaching, the Associated Press reports. 20. To follow up on the success of the Louisiana voucher program for school education, a study reported in 2016 that students that enrolled in a voucher program fell nearly 50% in math achievement and over 15% in reading. 21. The point is that not every child can attend a private or charter school. So instead of abandoning public school in the inner cities, how about both Republicans and Democrats come up with a master plan to rebuild the inner cities and the public schools? As a candidate, Donald Trump said he was going to make the situation for African Americans so much better. To paraphrase, he said, what do they have to lose by voting for him? Taking money from the poorest public schools built in the 1950s, where the tiles are falling from the ceilings and where many of the kids don't attend a full 5 days of school a week, is not a good start. The public schools have become a place where many children can be safe for 6 hours, get at least 2 meals a day and interact with adults who are not on drugs or beat them. These teachers are their mentors. We need to put teachers on a pedestal once again in the United States and consider teaching an altruistic career. Of course there are some bad teachers. Public schools employ over 3 million teachers. With that number, the odds are pretty good each school district across the country will employ men and women who should not teach. Public education is not the only place where the unfortunate problem of bad employees can be cited as an example what is imperfect in America. There are bad workers in all jobs, public and private. The difference comes from the fact that public schools are paid for by hard-working taxpayers. This is something all teachers know and need to always be cognitive of during times of economic hardship in the United States. After the release of DeVos' budget, even Republican leaders said these deep cuts would not happen. The urgent task at hand for both Republicans and Democrats is to solve one of the United States' oldest problems of inner-city decay and public school abandonment. The fact that public schools are being shut down in poor inner cities, leading to the possibility 92 of overcrowding in private schools, is a huge challenge in the 21st century. Has the idea of the public in public schools become obsolete in this new age of individualism? Or can a group of people find answers to lead a renaissance of the idea that all Americans should be educated to not only learn about the American dream, but live it? Chapter 6. The world is watching again. Abstract: the United States is the leader of the free world. There is no doubt about this statement. Donald Trump is now the President of the United States, and the eyes of the world are upon America like at no other time perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis under President John F. Kennedy in 1962. As the world fights ISIS and its evil thinking, the United States needs the united part of our name more than ever. President Trump was elected with 46% of the popular vote. Can Trump lay off the Twitter and deliver the leadership all Americans deserve? Or is President Trump just focused on giving his base the red meat it craves in today's media of age, in which every news story is fake unless it comes from Fox and Friends or Rush Limbaugh? The answers are coming at us swiftly, so don't blink. Keywords: President Trump, free world, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, foreign policy. The world looks upon the United States as the land of the free, and every 4 years the individual voters of America reciprocate by casting their one vote for the President of the United States. The envy of those who don't understand what democracy means, who live in countries decimated by war, terror, and starvation, cannot be realized until fear leaves their conscience. Those who don't speak English but watch the daily news saw the 2016 presidential election unfold as a year-long comedy befitting a 396 Stooges marathon, waiting for Donald Trump to walk over and poke Hillary Clinton in the eyes during their second debate. The United States, at 240 years, is still rather young in comparison with many governments across the globe. The capitalist experiment continues to be refined, challenged, loaded with failures, and celebrated in numerous success stories. The United States evolved in the context of white, privileged males making laws and dictating policy during its first 175 years of existence. It is not possible to list all the African American heroes who have suffered from oppression in the United States. However, the voice of Martin Luther King, Jr. in the 1960s showed the world that the African American population had risen to new heights in a democracy still dominated by white men. The inclusion of all races and genders in democracy was slowly expanding as new generations of Americans demanded equality not only through laws, but taught throughout society as a question of morals. Academia and bureaucrats. The idea of trying to save the world from catastrophic climate change, war, hunger, and oppression was definitely part of the progressive movement led by Senator Bernie Sanders in 2016. Young millennials gravitated to Senator Sanders as a senior citizen who spoke for a United States that would move forward to educate all who wanted to learn, provide health care to all who needed it, clean air and water to all who wanted it, and represent everyone who did not want to be judged based on whom they chose to love. The differences between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton during their run for the Democratic Party nomination were very apparent. 2 votes in the past 20 years were significant in terms of displaying each candidate's progressive credentials. Bernie voted against the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996 and the use of military force in Iraq in October 2002 as a congressman from Vermont. Hillary Clinton did not come around to supporting gay and lesbian marriage until 2013. Clinton also voted as a senator from New York to give President George W. Bush and his national security apparatus the go-ahead to invade Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks on the United States. After all was said and done, Hillary Clinton secured the Democratic nomination, to the dismay of many Bernie Sanders supporters. The main contention of the Sanders supporters was over the superdelegates, an 97 institutional system put in place in 1982 by the Democratic National Committee after the landslide loss by Senator George McGovern in 1972 to incumbent Richard Nixon and President Jimmy Carter's huge defeat to Ronald Reagan in 1980. How much of an edge did this give to Clinton over Sanders? The edge was enormous. The Pew Center for Research had the numbers in the summer of 2016 as shown here. According to our count, 500 superdelegates are backing Clinton against just 42 for Sanders. That translates into 498 and 41 convention votes, respectively, because the superdelegates representing overseas Democrats have a half vote each. More than 85% of Democratic governors, senators, and representatives are supporting Clinton, as are 61% of superdelegates from the DNC. 1. It would seem to most political observers that the Democratic Party needs to reform the superdelegate system in order for the new millennial Democrats to feel part of the nominating format. George McGovern and the New Left had the political foresight to know that the 1968 nomination of Vice President Hubert Humphrey was extremely flawed, leading to much of the dysfunction and anger that seized the 1968 Democratic Convention. Many of Sanders' supporters will be watching with consternation to see if the newly elected chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, has the fortitude to work with the progressive left to shake the label of being a part of a voting system that has its predetermined establishment candidate. The politics of issues such as climate change has divided the two major parties based not on the science, but more on loyalty to a political ideology. American democracy has become incredibly cynical about highly educated experts in specific areas of science because the internet has made it easy for individuals to become graduates of Google University. The American voter has become cynical towards science and what a large number of people would consider facts. American democracy has become a never-ending conspiracy theory based on someone's ability to create a website. Americans no longer feel that education is a path to becoming an expert in a specific field. One's own personal belief in what the United States should look like has taken over civility towards those who don't share the same beliefs. The idea that America's brightest scientists sent a man to the moon has been discredited by some as fake, all filmed and staged on a Hollywood 98 movie stage. Some parents do not get their children vaccinated because it is against their religious beliefs or because they believe it may cause autism. This argument flies in the face of centuries of highly educated doctors working tirelessly to find cures for polio, tuberculosis, and yellow fever. There is a very small group of Americans that believe the United States government was behind the 9/11 attacks. Absurd, sick people say that the Newtown school shootings never happened. A person accuses the President of the United States of not being born in Hawaii as part of a 55-year plot to anoint a Kenyan king. And how does American democracy react to the latter news? The Republican primary voters nominate him as the Republican nominee for president, and 46% of voters actually elect him President of the United States. No longer are academic titles seen as prestigious, indicating the nation's brightest who can assist in solving some of mankind's most difficult problems. There was a time where those who served in the federal government were seen as respectable, hard-working, and loyal to the country they served. However, as the federal government has grown in size, that trait has become incomprehensible to the American people. The word bureaucrat has gained such a negative connotation that all federal workers are seen as faceless burdens. Did the bureaucrats create the ever-growing federal government? No. They are Americans who needed a job and filled a position created by elected representatives. As the United States population reaches over 315 million, the need to assist these people will continue to grow. This not a defense of keeping the federal government growing with endless programs to solve every single problem individuals face. Democrats, specifically the liberals, must realize that some programs had a purpose that they are no longer fulfilling. Liberals need to communicate the message that they want to streamline the federal government. This sounds much more feasible politically than allowing the Republican right to continue to accuse the left of being the only big spenders when in power. The debate between the two major parties should be about which party can make the American voters' government run as efficiently as possible. The conservative ideology of returning to a smaller federal government will never come to fruition. As a nation that continues to grow, we can't go back to the pre-Depression days of a rural America envisioned by Thomas Jefferson, or a society sheltered from the rest of the world as executed with fervor by the trio of Presidents Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. If anything, the federal government will 99. Need to keep expanding in terms of bureaucracy. When the country reaches 350 million people, realities will supersede ideology. If one doesn't think so, just look at the Republican governors pleading for the House of Representatives and Senate under the leadership of Republicans Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell not to take away their state's Medicaid benefits expanded under the Affordable Care Act. If the two-party system cannot make the reality of a growing federal government semi-effective, a dysfunctional society will spill over into state and local governments, making taxpayers reach for their wallet either way. This idea was put into practice some 30 years ago. Supply-side economics in the 1980s promised to cut taxes, decrease regulation, and reduce deficits. President Reagan vowed that the federal government would not be a nuisance in the lives of everyday Americans. State and local governments would take the lead in educating children, protecting individual civil rights, controlling crime, and addressing environmental concerns. The Sanders campaign and the surprisingly deep and devoted support it garnered in 2015 to 2016 was a direct challenge to the idea that the federal government's role needs to be scaled back. Young millennials embraced the idea of a society where education doesn't mean bankruptcy and health care for all doesn't mean having to choose between medicine or a meal. For many of these young voters, ideology had nothing to do with politics, theirs was a choice between what is right and what is wrong. The fight within the Democratic Party between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton for the nomination was a reminder of the 1972 fight over the direction of the Democratic Party. At that time, insurgent Senator of South Dakota George McGovern took on the establishment Democrats, including the likes of former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Senator Edmund Muskie and Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. McGovern's political army of millions of young recruits pounding the pavement felt it had been worth the long hours when in the early morning of July 13, 1972 Senator George McGovern accepted the Democratic Party's nomination as their presidential candidate. A new generation of Democrats were infiltrating politics, including women, African Americans, gays, lesbians, and youths. This new left movement started in the early 1960s and reached its peak with the nomination of George McGovern. The field of political science will be watching closely to see if the millennial support under the leadership of Bernie Sanders will start a new political movement identified as the societal left in which compassion for one's fellow citizens is a 100. Collective ideology. A new generation of voters are pushing the health and education of a democratic society to the forefront of future economic success. As has already been discussed in this book, the primary brawl that blindsided so many establishment Republicans led to the election of President Donald Trump. This then turned the Republican Party into a dysfunctional political organization. As his presidency entered its second year, Trump declared war on the media, tweeted accusations against his predecessor President Obama, scolded allies of the United States, fully implemented his roundup of illegal immigrants and backed a tax cut plan that will add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years according to the CBO. In May 2017, President Trump took his act abroad and the people of Europe and the Middle East were to witness what all the fuss was about for the first time. The American president was on the world stage. Mr. Trump going international. The reaction to President Trump's first international trip, 9 days in all, was mixed, but it was summed up nicely by Max Greenwood of The Hill. Greenwood listed 5 major takeaways. 1. Trump took a softer tone on Islam. 2. He reaffirmed support for Israel and pressed for Middle East peace. 3. He berated NATO over defense spending. 4. He declined to pledge support for the Paris Climate Agreement. 5. He never held a press conference. The sideshow that follows Donald Trump doesn't stop at the U.S. border. Greenwood's summary focuses on the substance of Trump's first trip, but Trump always provides plenty of comedic material. Shoving the Prime Minister of Montenegro out of the way to get to the front of the photo op with world leaders was a classic Trumpesque move. First Lady Melania Trump slapping away of Trump's hand after their arrival in Israel lit up the internet. One of Trump's moments that will go over well with most Americans regardless of their support of him or not was when he most definitely berated the NATO leaders in an outdoor speech about their country's failure to pay their fair share for military defense. This was more than an embarrassment for many of these leaders as they stood together in world unity with expressions of bewilderment. 101. President Trump feels that peace in the Middle East is something that will not be as difficult as some political leaders over the past 70 years have made it. There are those who forget that peace in the Middle East was achieved between two enemy nations. The Camp David peace accord brokered by President Jimmy Carter between the Israeli government led by Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the Egyptian government headed by President Anwar Sadat in 1978 required 13 days of intense and difficult discussions. The actual peace treaty between Israel and Egypt was signed on March 26, 1979. 3. In December 2017, President Trump added an additional controversy to the Middle East region as he declared Jerusalem Israel's capital, breaking a long-standing U.S. and international policy of not formally recognizing Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. 4. As Palestinians express their outrage over the United States move, other Arab nations' dismay will only make peace in the Middle East more difficult to secure. Confidence in a U.S. president is important not only among American citizens, but also among the allies of the United States. If the USA is fighting ISIS, talking tough to North Korea, dealing with China, undercutting Russian intelligence or preventing a conflict in an understudied African nation, every word spoken by the president may be interpreted as a solution to a problem. President Trump faced several major foreign policy decisions in the first months of his presidency, let alone the first year. President Obama left Trump with a solid economy compared with what Obama inherited from George W. Bush. Unfortunately, President Trump and the Republican Party focused their important first 100 days on repealing the health care program, in part because of the name attached to it. Instead of focusing on the missiles being launched by the young dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump wanted a health care victory under his belt. With Donald Trump, it is all about the win. However, tweeting about fake media, about Obamacare being a huge disaster and belittling his own party members was more important. Foreign policy could wait. A self-declared great negotiator such as Donald Trump could easily deal with foreign leaders simply because these leaders and their countries were not up to the standard of American power. The anti-immigrant rhetoric and isolationist view of the world as repeated throughout the 2016 presidential campaign by Donald Trump is now the American government's stated foreign policy. 102. President Trump's reception among NATO allies was at best lukewarm. The importance of the United States having allies is at an all-time high. As the United States targets ISIS all across the globe and tries to put a lid on rogue dictators in parts of the world most Americans could not place on the correct continent, another problem has consumed the Trump administration in its first 4 months, the Russia Federation and its authoritarian President Vladimir Putin. As the Republican candidate for president, Donald Trump urged the Russian government to find and release emails related to Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State under President Obama. Winning the 2016 presidential election was not a personal objective for Donald Trump, but destroying Hillary Clinton was, even if it required using an enemy regime. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing, Mr. Trump said during a news conference here in an apparent reference to Mrs. Clinton's deleted emails. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. 5. The call for a foreign adversary to hack a United States presidential candidate was and most likely will be the first and last time this occurs without any consequences. A Republican candidate's open request to the President of Russia to interfere in and disrupt a United States presidential election had to sicken those in the Republican Party who had fought authoritarianism and dictatorships for over half a century. Does any lifelong Republican honestly think that former President Ronald Reagan would endorse using the help of an authoritarian enemy to win an election? American politics is brutal. The American system of electing men and women to represent our best interests has a number of flaws, starting with the ridiculous amounts of money spent to get one person elected. However bad the American political system has become, it is our system. The American people own it and must participate in it, or others with bad intentions against America will. Our system should not nominate candidates from any party that seek the help of the seediest of authoritarians the world has to offer, such as the likes of Vladimir Putin. The investigation into Russian efforts to hack and sway the presidential election towards Donald Trump and the firing of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is just beginning. The department's investigating. 103. The Russians' election meddling is a who's who of the federal government. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the United States Treasury Department, the Department of Defense, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate Judiciary Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, and the House Oversight Committee. 6. Allegations of numerous Trump administration officials being connected with Russian government officials have been coming fast and furious as the United States gears up for the long road ahead with the pivotal investigation of former FBI Director Robert Mueller. The Republican Party leaders, including Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, have been more than reluctant to appoint an independent counsel to investigate the Russian meddling into the U.S. presidential election. The fate of Trump's presidency will be in the hands of the Washington, D.C. swamp he is trying to drain. As president, Trump is finding out that the swamp he promised as a candidate to drain reaches all facets of American life, including his business world and its associates. As Americans watch their television sets each day and receive constant updates on their cell phones with breaking news, running Washington, D.C. like a business isn't as simple as saying you're fired. Words matter, decisions kill. President Richard Nixon found out that ending the war in Vietnam was perhaps the most difficult foreign policy challenge that ever faced the American presidency. President Johnson lost his job because of his failures in Vietnam. Nixon, as a presidential candidate in 1968, never said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, but he was less than forthcoming with details, as described by historian Robert Dallek. After pledging in New Hampshire in March that he would end the war and win the peace in the Pacific, reporters kept pressing him to explain how he would achieve these ends. Although he never spoke of a secret plan to end the war, he did keep his counsel on just how he would ensure peace and security. 7. Dallek continued. 104. He refused, however, to provide any details on how he would end the conflict, saying that if he revealed what he intended, it would fatally weaken his bargaining position if he became president. 8. More than 58,000 American men lost their lives in the Vietnam War. President Lyndon Johnson and President Richard Nixon had the most invested in terms of foreign policy decisions made in planning and executing the Vietnam War. The more than 58,000 men killed in a faraway country over 45 years ago touches those who still remember their son, brother, uncle, or father. For the soldiers, their best friends and others who were strangers were dying by their sides. It is important to teach high school and college students across America that the decisions of the president have life and death implications. As American voters go into the voting booth, they need to understand that choosing a president is a serious decision. As Americans with the privilege of being able to choose their leaders, voters should be able to look with pride at the person for whom they cast their vote for leader of the free world. The decision by President Trump to drop out of the Paris Climate Accord, leaving the United States as one of only 3 nations not on board with the agreement, is also telegraphing a message. America is fine with being isolationist and drumming up its new nationalism under a Trump administration. President Trump explained his reasoning for the United States exiting the Paris Accords. The climate agreement would undermine our economy, hamstring our workers, weaken our sovereignty, and put us at a permanent disadvantage to the other countries of the world, he said. It is time to exit the Paris Accord. The climate deal was less about the climate and more about other countries gaining a financial advantage over the United States, he said, adding that we don't want other leaders and other countries laughing at us anymore, and they won't be. 9. As a candidate, Donald Trump said he would save the coal industry by pulling us out of a bad climate deal, the Paris Climate Accord. He did just that, fulfilling a campaign promise after becoming president. Obviously, a pro-Trump, deep red state such as West Virginia will be happy, as coal provides approximately 15,490 jobs there. 10. The coal industry overall in the United States as of 2016 provided just over 56,000 jobs, down from 105. Its peak of 178,000 in 1985. 11. President Trump is looking out for the voters who supported him in terms of targeted employment. When these coal miners get sick, will they support the Republican Party's promise to repeal the Affordable Care Act? Although the Republicans in the Senate had not succeeded in their repeal efforts by the end of 2017, one can never say it is over as long as these same Republicans maintain their majority. The nation will have to wait and see on an issue that affects millions of Americans. How did the leaders of other nations react to President Trump's announcement of the United States' decision to leave the Paris Accord? Here are just two of the official statements from foreign leaders. 12. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau: We are deeply disappointed that the United States federal government has decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Canada is unwavering in our commitment to fight climate change and support clean economic growth. UK Prime Minister Theresa May: The Prime Minister expressed her disappointment with the decision and stressed that the UK remained committed to the Paris Agreement, as she set out recently at the G7. She said that the Paris Agreement provides the right global framework for protecting the prosperity and security of future generations, while keeping energy affordable and secure for our citizens and businesses. The idea that climate change is man-made is accepted by 97% of scientists, but the American voter is now a scientist as well, Googling a website that can find 3% of scientists that agree with their view that it is not man-made. 13. This statement will be met with skepticism and outright disagreement. Rejecting science, as mentioned earlier, has become a matter of political party loyalty. If readers don't think decisions by elected officials or those in power matter when it comes to issues of clean air and water, just ask the residents of Flint, Michigan. In January 2017, Jim Lynch of the Detroit News wrote that new statistics on Genesee County pneumonia deaths in 2014 and 2015 align with some expert opinions that the Flint water crisis most likely resulted in more than the 12 Legionnaire's disease deaths already linked to it. 14. As with many issues facing society in the United States and abroad, if it doesn't affect one personally, then most likely one doesn't care. This isn't necessarily a condemnation of people in the United States or elsewhere. Most human beings only react to a crisis. The prevention of a crisis is where. 106. Human beings seem to be unable to learn from past catastrophes. Can a society prevent all crises? Absolutely not. However, if one examines crisis after crisis throughout history in countries all around the globe, there is ample information that could definitely minimize the damage. The importance of looking back at historical disasters is important. There are those who say the event is already over, there is nothing we can do to reverse the outcome. One needn't be an academic to agree with that statement. But, once again, it is important to discover the truth about what happened and why. Researchers are finding more evidence every day of how hundreds of historical events truly happened, not the myths repeated over and over again throughout time. How we long for the days of Watergate. Bring back the days of Watergate. What? Why would the United States want to go back and base our democracy on one of the United States' most serious constitutional crises? A simple answer is bipartisanship. Although readers of this book may not have ever heard of Senator Sam Ervin and Senator Howard Baker, they should become familiar with them if today's political spectacle of investigating the role Russia played in the United States presidential election is to be pursued seriously. Ervin, a Democrat from North Carolina, and Baker, a Republican from Tennessee, were chairman and vice chairman of the Senate Select Committee to investigate campaign practices, or the Senate Watergate Committee as it is more popularly known today. These two men from 1973 to 1974 navigated the country through a period when the White House became an island unto itself. Isolation, deceit, criminal activity, and desperation turned Washington, D.C. into a spy movie that made James Bond look boring. However, Irvin and Baker put aside political party labels and followed the law, culminating in the first ever resignation of a President of the United States. The investigation into General Michael Flynn, Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election and possible obstruction of justice charges against President Trump have become ultra-partisan. If one doesn't believe these types of statements, just look at the suspicious activities of the former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Devin Nunes, who stepped down from his role as chairman in April. CNN editor-at-large Chris Cillizza discussed Nunes' reasons for stepping down. 107. At issue is an at-the-time secret trip Nunes took to the White House last month in which he was briefed the incidental collection of information from Trump campaign officials as the result of a surveillance program directed at foreign nationals. Nunes revealed that he had briefed President Trump on the information before he had briefed the members of his own committee. Ethics experts suggested that Nunes had created a massive conflict of interest with the trip and the meeting with Trump, raising major questions about whether he could be impartial in leading the investigation by his committee. 15. Nunes acting like a fool by running to the White House with good news is as partisan as it gets. Nunes should have just stood in front of the White House with a newspaper yelling, "Hear the good news." Nunes' suspicious activities seem especially partisan in that he left the minority ranking member, Democrat Adam Schiff, in the dark. And if Nunes' first act was not quite enough, he topped that with the infamous House Intelligence Committee Republican memo that was released on February 2, 2018, purportedly showing the bias and coordinated effort of the FBI and the Justice Department in their investigation of possible ties between President Trump and the Russian government during the 2016 presidential campaign. 16. There is hope for bipartisanship on the Senate side of this investigation. Senator Richard Burr, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, is working with Democrat Senator Mark Warner. Will this continue to be the case if the investigation gets closer to the White House and President Trump? Once again, only time will tell. President Trump went to the G20 meeting in Hamburg, Germany in early July 2017 and confronted the man behind much of the 2016 presidential election controversy, President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The word is that President Trump asks Putin directly if the Russian government or its intelligence agencies had anything to do with the disruption and meddling of the US president election in 2016. Of course, Putin denied the accusations in private with President Trump. Trump then repeated Putin's denial to the media. The word of Putin is all we have as American citizens, that our most fundamental gift from democracy, the vote, was not compromised by a foreign country. The grizzly bear wandering through the woods was once considered a dangerous foe ready to pounce at any time, as famously seized upon by the Republican Party under President Reagan in a 1984 campaign ad. Now this same party's leader, President Trump, seems to be encouraging his followers to feed the grizzly bear to keep it content and on his side. 108. Chapter 7. Conclusions. Abstract. American voters in 2016 followed the lead of the Know-Nothing Party of 1,856 in succumbing to the fear of United States sovereignty being compromised by European neediness and Muslim infiltration into the American way of life. The difference between the two, 160 years apart, is twofold: technology and Donald Trump. Trump's bold statements of whatever comes to mind are sent out in a matter of seconds via Twitter. His speeches are heard live by millions of people. Millions of internet bloggers comment on his inflammatory rhetoric in a matter of minutes. That is the difference. The message of hate, anger, and partisanship is communicated too quickly for people to determine what is accurate and what is fake news. Keywords: Know Nothing, Donald Trump, Muslims, fake news. Political party realignments in the United States have occurred at least 5 times since the country was founded in 1800, 1828, 1860, 1896 and 1932. Some political scientists have suggested 1964 and 1980 as more recent presidential elections showing lasting realignment tendencies. Where does the 2016 presidential election of Donald Trump fall? We won't know the answer until after the midterm elections of 2018 and of course the 2020 presidential election. 112. The question of where American democracy is heading is not just perplexing to political scientists, but of concern to any citizen armed with knowledge of United States history. The Know Nothing Party was developed and formed out of fear of non-native and non-Protestant people. This fear was evident at the outset within the original 13 colonies, but it was contained to a few states and locales. The influx of immigrants in the first half of the 19th century accelerated the nativist feeling of urgency to find a political solution to stop the foreign influence. The apex of this fear would claim one of its biggest prizes, former President of the United States Millard Fillmore, the nation's 13th president. Fillmore attached his name to a political party that based its platform on hatred and fear. Although he lost and the Know Nothing Party faded away, the lesson of their movement should not. The first 60 years of a young United States of America attempting to find itself led to an era of political parties realigning themselves 3 times. The leadership of men such as Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Hamilton was handed off to Jackson, Clay, Van Buren and Webster, leading to Lincoln, Douglas, and Calhoun. Each time the United States found itself facing a crisis, strong leadership along with the ability to compromise rose to the forefront. Differences over foreign allies, slavery, banking, and westward expansion forced a young nation to confront its destiny and its demons. The United States slowly began to leave behind its prejudices and discriminatory laws. For many in the United States, it took much too long for them to share in the day-to-day freedoms enjoyed by the white men of privilege. This book was not written to promote a new ideology. At this point in the history of American politics, voters have rejected the idea that academia or science should explain to them what is happening to their democracy. Intellectualism has been condemned to stay within the walls of university classrooms. Academia seems to be mocked by those who don't study a specific discipline or just don't care to listen to those who do. When the brilliance of academia does leave the walls of the classroom, the message is lost in a distorted 2-minute soundbite on an extreme entertainment program dedicated to its own ideological cause. A nation that has prided itself on social evolution may be heading backwards. There are many who are searching for unique leaders who do not want to slide backwards into a social past fraught with prejudice and discrimination. A word that seems to have replaced liberal as the new political poison in American voter lingo is compromise. Leading up to the 2 realignments starting in 1820 and then again in 1850, Henry Clay and Daniel. 113. Webster facilitated 2 compromises in order to avoid sectional conflicts over slavery. Of course, those familiar with American history will point out that these compromises only delayed the inevitable coming of the American Civil War. The alternative would have been to let a mob invoke anarchy to decide which land to take for themselves and set up any type of labor arrangement that suited their needs. Anarchy within a structured democracy would have taken over the United States in the 19th century. The United States had a small taste of this mob mentality when the question of the future of slavery in the Kansas, Nebraska Territory led to Bleeding Kansas from 1854 until 1861. A precursor to what America might become was too large for the likes of Stephen Douglas, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. A leader with a heavenly aura was summoned from the North to save a nation that had lost its direction. The American Party, or Know Nothing Party, defines a brief period in American political history when nationalism, nativism, and Protestantism were espoused by a minority from within a majority Christian faith. Discrimination against Catholicism did not end with the displacement of the Know Nothing Party. Anti-Catholic sentiment eventually faded to the point where a majority of Protestant American voters felt comfortable enough to help elect a Catholic president of the United States in 1960. American voters in 2016 followed the lead of the Know Nothing Party of 1,856 in succumbing to the fear of United States sovereignty being compromised by European neediness and Muslim infiltration into the American way of life. The difference between the two, 160 years apart, is twofold: technology and Donald Trump. Trump's bold statements of whatever comes to mind are sent out in a matter of seconds via Twitter. His speeches are heard live by millions of people. Millions of internet bloggers comment on his inflammatory rhetoric in a matter of minutes. That is the difference. The message of hate, anger, and partisanship is communicated too quickly for people to determine what is accurate and what is fake news. The American people have allowed themselves to be duped into believing their democracy is under attack from extremist ideological views from both the left and the right. And as this occurs, the Russian government watches with pleasure as one of the United States' greatest strengths, our freedom of the press, is attacked as an unreliable nuisance. The message of the Know Nothing Party was communicated through pamphlets, newspapers, and word of mouth, reaching hundreds in a matter of weeks. The nomination of Millard Fillmore as the Know Nothing. Conclusions. 114. Candidate was not due to Fillmore's enlightening personality or boisterous rhetoric. He was nominated largely because he was a former president and he gladly accepted. However, with all this said, Millard Fillmore is an important person in American history. He was the 13th President of the United States. Although he may not have been one of the most memorable or the best, Fillmore had a role in the country's development because the President of the United States does matter. Donald Trump was able to use American voters' fears as a platform to communicate the notion that the United States of America was collapsing into a third-rate country. Does this fear sound familiar? Has America become a nation of individuals wanting to protect a century of old prejudices? The realignment in politics is not going to materialize from among the Trump voters of 2016, but the Clinton voters of 2016. Many of these voters were supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders. The millennials aged 18 to 36 will guarantee that power returns to the left wing of the political spectrum. These millennials will not necessarily have to identify with the Democratic Party. These individuals want to see progress on social issues, not to slide backwards. A democracy will only survive because of how its citizens make it allowable for those who differ from them in terms of appearance, religious beliefs, and cultural diversity to live without fear. We as human beings are all different. Definitely no academia or science needed here. We are all free to think for ourselves, care for ourselves, and love for ourselves. Democracy is free thanks to the efforts of those who came before us. Many soldiers died in the battles of Lexington, Lake Erie, Veracruz, Antietam, San Juan Hill, Somme, Guadalcanal, Wake Island, and Key San, Hamburger Hill, Fallujah, and Tora Bora. A United States democracy has produced those who perform in the top tier of human professions. Nurses at all levels take care of the very sick, and their pay is certainly not the reason for the uncontrollable cost of American health care. Doctors operate on the most damaged organs or failing hearts, demonstrating that saving human lives is at times inconceivable. Men and women work in hospice facilities, helping to comfort people at the end of their lives. These people take care of individuals when they know there is nothing they can do to bring them back. And once again, these healthcare workers are sure as hell not doing it for the money. Then there are the volunteers who go out on the streets of some of the largest cities to help the homeless, drug addicted, and sick. These men and women are at the front of an altruistic society that must be recognized. The list of people looking out for their fellow human beings goes on: police, firefighters, and ambulance drivers, and most definitely our teachers. 115. These points all circle back to the idea of inclusion in American society. Healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, police, firefighters, and teachers are not asked what their religious affiliation or political beliefs may be. The practice of excluding our fellow citizens, African American, Chinese, Jewish, Irish, because of their looks or beliefs has dramatically declined. However, There are areas in the United States where some of these aforementioned citizens are still not welcomed. However, individuals should not feel content that my nationality or religious background is accepted, so I don't need to rock the political boat. Speaking out against discrimination and prejudice should never take a day off. Southern politics under segregationist governors George Wallace of Alabama, Lester Maddox of Georgia and Ross Barnett of Mississippi, along with numerous powerful segregationist Southern senators such as Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, John Sparkman of Alabama and Richard Russell of Louisiana, lawfully suppressed equality. The tide had turned by the early 1970s when non-segregationist Reuben Askew and Jimmy Carter were elected governor of Florida and Georgia respectively. A new generation of voters began to slowly erode the ideology of suppression. The presidential campaign of George Wallace in 1968 succeeded in securing almost 10 million votes. The Democrat and Republican brand of policy and politics was not meeting the needs of middle-class America, which felt it was being ignored and bled financially in order to feed an out-of-control federal government. If this was not enough, rioting and protesters were threatening the security of the new suburban way of life. Angry black men and long-haired young white men not wanting to fight for their country was not the America that the greatest generation had crafted after the Great Depression and World War II. If some of these themes still sound familiar in America today, it is because they have not been resolved in a democracy experimenting and debating what inclusion and freedom should entail. As a candidate, Donald Trump tapped into these same fears 50 years after George Wallace had done so. The growing federal government, black crime in the inner cities, struggling public schools in these same areas, white policemen under scrutiny for shooting black men, gays, and lesbians challenging and winning their civil rights, and terrorism by radical Muslim extremists has many Americans in fear. America's failure to amend its democracy has been apparent in 2 of the last 5 presidential elections when the popular vote winner ended up. Conclusions. 116. Losing the White House to the Electoral College winner. Meanwhile, the 2004 and 2012 presidential elections were decided by a difference of less than 4% between the incumbent president and the challenger. To say the political right did not like President Barack Obama or his policies is beyond an understatement. The 2016 election was divisive due to the 2 nominees Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. If you threw 20 names into a hat and had to pull out 2 of the most controversial to be their respective parties' candidates for president, Hillary and Donald would win you a prize. Does this mean that if John Kasich and Bernie Sanders had been the nominees, the divisions would have disappeared? No. However, Kasich's moderate conservatism with a touch of humanism and Sanders' likability and wholesomeness most likely would have tempered the bad taste of a loss on one side of the political scale. The Democratic Party is not going to have an easy job in choosing their nominee in 2020. The progressive faction following the message of Bernie Sanders wants substantive changes within the Democratic Party. However, the rural areas of the Rust Belt states such as Ohio, Pennsylvania and Michigan more than likely will still not be ready for further progress. And of course, the extent to which voters in these areas will accept change will depend on the actions of President Trump and his administration going forward. Politically speaking, if the Democratic Party wanted to become more moderate in order to win back some of the states Clinton lost, Senator Jon Tester of Montana and former Governor of Montana Steve Bullock would be a savvy choice. Does this mean losing some of the Bernie Sanders young progressive voters? This is a possibility. The Democratic Party could go to the left and nominate a true liberal in Senator Elizabeth Warren. The obvious risk here is nominating another woman, and one from Massachusetts to boot. At this point in Donald Trump's presidency, presidential historians already have enough information to keep them busy for years to come. In fact, President Trump's first month was packed with more drama than President Franklin Roosevelt's original first 100 days. The United States is at a crossroads of political direction. The direction is not to the left or the right. The direction is forward or backwards. The American voters and those who didn't vote in 2016 will have a decision to make in 2018 and again in 2020. The footprints of American prejudice and discrimination are visible on the path that has led to the 21st century. We as a nation can look back at these footprints to see where they took us and where mistakes were 117 made. At the present time the United States political system is in a tug of war to maintain progress and equality. Is this a time to exit and head backwards, or do we as a nation stay on the highway looking for the next destination of societal enlightenment? Only time will tell. The next test will be on November 6, 2018, when the elections to determine control of the House of Representatives commence.